of British luxury cars. The first ship carrying aid for Gaza leaves from Cyprus. The government warns that the UK needs new gas power plants to keep the lights on. We'll speak to the Energy Minister in just a few minutes. Love Island star Amy Hart tells Sky News how she's bombarded with unwanted explicit photos. The first person in England convicted of cyber flashing is due to be sentenced today. Lions rescued from the war in Ukraine find a new home in South Africa. A very good morning to you, and thanks for joining us here on The Breakfast Show this Tuesday morning. Our top story. As Sky News investigation has found, hundreds of millions of pounds worth of British-made luxury vehicles are being sold in Russia, despite sanctions imposed after the invasion of Ukraine. Rolls-Royce, Bentley and Land Rover are among the top brands still found in Moscow sales rooms. Our economics and data editor Ed Conway has the story.
You don't have to go far in Moscow without seeing evidence of how much Russians love luxury goods. And that includes a lot of high-end Western brands and especially British automobiles.
Bentley.
After the invasion of Ukraine and the imposition of sanctions in 2022, that was all supposed to stop. Carmakers pledged not to send their new models there. But a Sky News investigation has found these exports seem to be continuing even now. Now, it's certainly true that UK car exports to Russia have fallen very sharply since the invasion, basically down to zero. But just look at what's happened over the same period with car exports to Azerbaijan. They have gone up at an unprecedented rate, into the hundreds of millions each year, up by 1,860%. We've never seen anything like that at all, raising the question, is something going on in Azerbaijan's economy? Well, not really. Developing economy, GDP about the same size as Ghana, 10 million people. But the main thing is, just look where it's sited, on the border of Russia. And when you look at what's happened to car exports from Azerbaijan to Russia since the invasion, they've done almost exactly the same thing as our exports to Azerbaijan. And that raises a final question. Where have our exports mainly come from? Well, the main port of departure is this one in the southwest of England. Up until the invasion of Ukraine, the port of Bristol had never seen more than a few £1 million of exports to Azerbaijan. In the past couple of years, that's risen to the hundreds of millions. This is one of the country's main ports for the import and export of cars. But among the models leaving here over the past 2 years have been thousands of high-end British cars going in vessels rather like that around Europe, into the Black Sea and ending up almost certainly in Russia. Our data shows it's been happening. The question is, why it hasn't been stopped. After all, the sale of cars over £42,000 to Russia is explicitly banned under the UK's sanctions regime. Legal experts say industry needs to be more vigilant about what happens when the goods leave the UK.
When it comes to what is happening in practice is most readily explained by a lack of due diligence. The industry has to be more aware of what red flags to look out for and what to do when they become aware of something that potentially looks like circumvention.
Britain's motoring lobby group, the SMMT, said UK vehicle manufacturers are committed to full compliance with all current and future trade sanctions. There is no available evidence to indicate a lack of compliance with existing sanctions, but manufacturers will remain vigilant and would condemn any party that puts their commitment to compliance at risk. Sanctions Minister Anne-Marie Trevelyan said the work of investigative journalists and NGOs' continuing efforts to highlight circumvention are an important part of our collective efforts to track and evidence Putin's abhorrent crimes. The Azerbaijani car exports are just a fraction of those Britain sends around the world, but it's a fraction that looks increasingly awkward for a country which has said it wants to wage economic war on Russia. Ed Conway, Sky News.
Oh, well, we'll be discussing that story more with Ed Conway later in the show. We're also in a moment going to be discussing the unemployment rates ticked up from 3.8% to 3.9%. Still low by historical standards, but a rise nonetheless, something the government won't have wanted to see. We'll have more of the detail, underlying detail of that cross in just a moment. But first, the government says the UK needs to build more gas power capacity, not risking blackouts to meet climate targets. Our political correspondent Mario Roy is here with me now. So Mari, talk to me about what's being actually formally announced today or what's in the statement that the government's put out.
So, essentially, the plan the government is announcing today is nothing really that new. Essentially, what they're saying is we need to be realistic with moving toward our net zero targets and meeting our energy expectations and our energy targets, and therefore, part of being realistic and pragmatic is actually the fact that we are going to have to use gas nonetheless sometimes to kind of plug those gaps. So they're talking about increasing demand, talking about flexibility, and the fact that, for instance, on the days where it's not very sunny or it's not very windy, we can't rely on renewables, for example, we're going to need to use gas to kind of fill in the gaps as and when. Now, obviously, certain climate groups are very disappointed by this. They always want the government to go harder and faster when it comes to green targets. But I think what's interesting also is they're announcing potential energy regional pricing. So if you, for example, you live near a wind farm or something like that, you might get reduced energy on your bills. Now, it's quite controversial in some ways because you could end up with regional disparities between energy prices, and while energy prices are really quite high and a substantial amount of household expenditure at the moment, that could ruffle some feathers. But I think nonetheless, you talk to a lot of Tory MPs who've been campaigning on this for quite a while. I mean, I've been speaking to Tory MPs about this for a couple of years now. And the thing that they say is there's been a lot of local backlash to, for instance, wind farms, and therefore this is an incentive to allow people to build more capacity by saying, don't worry, yes, it might be near you, might be in your backyard, but you'll be financially better off for it. And it's a way to incentivise that, to kind of reduce the local resistance, as it were.
A key nuance to that announcement today, Mari. Thank you. And we're going to be talking to the Government Minister, Graham Stuart, the Minister for Energy Security and Net Zero, in about 5 or 10 minutes' time on that story. But first, Leah, time for the other top stories.
Thanks, Wilfred. A ship taking almost 200 tonnes of food to Gaza left a port in Cyprus. It's part of a pilot project to open a new sea route of aid to Palestinians, and that's Larnaca port there. Live pictures for you. Haiti's Prime Minister, Ariel Henry, is to resign after weeks of mounting pressure and violence in the country. Over the last 6 weeks, gunmen have carried out a series of attacks on government buildings. Ariel Henry, who was on a foreign visit when the violence began, he remains in Puerto Rico, and he says he'll step down once a transitional council is created.
After the Council of Ministers tonight accepted to put into place a transitional presidential council, the members of the council will be picked after agreement with different sectors of the national life. The government I am running will remove itself immediately after the establishment of said council.
Lebanon has been hit by an Israeli airstrike. At least one person has been killed near the northeastern city of Baalbek, a Hezbollah stronghold. A Conservative Party donor has said he's deeply sorry following reports. He said former Labour MP Diana Abbott made him want to hate all black women. Frank Hester, Chief Executive of the Phoenix Partnership, which donated £10 million to the Tories last year, also reportedly said Miss Abbott should be shot. A spokesperson for Mr Hester admitted he had made rude comments but said they had nothing to do with her gender nor colour of skin. 9,000 people in England who didn't get their MMR vaccine as children are now being urged to get the jab. The move is part of a catch-up campaign to protect the population as cases of measles rise. 773 cases of the disease have been reported in England since October. Just 53 were confirmed all in 2022.
Well, now we're going to talk about cyber flashing. Saba's here on set with us. And the former Love Island contestant Amy Hart has spoken to Sky News about how she's been bombarded with unwanted explicit photos. And the first person in England convicted of cyber flashing, sending unsolicited photos to women, will be sentenced today. So, Saba, just talk us through the background of what we're talking about. A very brief definition there, but what is cyber flashing?
Sure. So cyber flashing is, as you mentioned, the unsolicited sharing of sexually explicit pictures online. It's something that's been illegal in England only since January the 31st this year, which is not very long at all when you compare it to Scotland, where cyberflashing has been illegal since 2009. But it does seem that England is playing catch-up. Later today, there will be a sentencing in place. A 39-year-old man called Nicholas Hawkes will be sentenced for this crime. He sent indecent pictures of himself to a 15-year-old schoolgirl. Now, this case will be very interesting indeed because it will set the tone for future cases and will set a precedent. Now, this is a widespread issue, one that Amy Hart, a former contestant on the popular reality TV show Love Island, spoke to Sky News about. She said that since she hit the 1 million mark of her social media followers, she's been constantly bombarded with indecent images. Now, she said to Sky News, speaking about her experience, you're flicking through the Instagram stories you've been tagged in, and they just pop up. These people tag loads of women in the public eye so they can say, this list of people have all seen my genitals. Now, researchers say that perpetrators do this because in some cases they're living out fantasies. In other cases, it may be a case of asserting male dominance, you know, to shock, to fear and intimidate simply because you can. Now, there is no one homogenous reason for why this happens, but those are some that researchers have spoken about.
To link it to this sentencing today, is what Amy Hart is being forced to go through illegal, or is the sentencing today, which you said related to a 15-year-old girl being sent images, only illegal because the person is underage? Well,
it's tricky. Now, talking about today's sentencing, campaigners are saying that it's, you know, a step forwards, but there's still a long way to go, and that's because intent of the perpetrator has to be proved. So if they did it for sexual gratification or to cause distress, that's when it becomes illegal. And I'm sure that the underage element with the case that we're seeing today is a major factor as well. But with Amy Hart and with the thousands of other cases that we do see on a daily basis, it's tricky to get prosecuted because, as I say, intent needs to be proven, and that's where it gets really tricky.
Yeah, I mean, if found guilty, perpetrator could face up to 2 years in prison, 10 years on the sex offenders register. But when we think about this arena, you should feel safe wherever you are. You shouldn't have to receive any unwanted images of any kind. And that's a problem, isn't it? Because as a woman, you feel like, actually, I need to make sure I'm safe. I need to make sure that I'm not able to be tagged on someone's image on Instagram, or I need to switch off my Bluetooth so I don't receive unwanted images. But there's a wider cultural education that I think that needs to be done to stop people from doing this in the first place, because it's remarkable, just speaking to some of the ladies in makeup, about how often this is happening.
Yeah, unfortunately, it does seem to be something that is quite normalised. And as you say, the onus is on the victim. Many cases, victims do tend to be, according to research and anecdotally, women to, as you say, switch off their Bluetooth settings or AirDrop if they have an iPhone. So there is a lot of work to be done, indeed.
Mm-hmm. Saba, great stuff. Thank you. We're going to have a quick look at the weather now.
Warm memories wherever you go. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
It'll be an unsettled week, but it will turn warmer as southwesterly winds set in. The far north and east look fine through the rush hour, but Wales and central and western England will be wet, while southern Scotland, Ireland and Northern Ireland will be rather murky and damp. Britain will see rain extending to remaining parts this morning, locally heavy and prolonged over England and Wales, but the southwest will see the rain giving way to patchy, drizzly outbreaks later on today, with the occasional light rain or drizzle. That's your weather.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Well, the government says it needs more gas power stations to keep the lights on, and the Minister for Energy Security and Net Zero, Graham Stuart, is here this morning with me to discuss this. Very good morning to you, Graham.
Good morning.
Thanks for joining us. Going to come to that announcement in a moment. Just wondered what the the mood was this morning with Lee Anderson's defection yesterday?
Well, it's a shame that Lee decided to move on. Obviously, he moved from the Labour Party to the Conservative Party. Now he's with Reform, and I wish him well. But we're determined to, focus on supporting Rishi Sunak and making sure that he, rather than Keir Starmer, is the Prime Minister after the next election. That's what the Conservative family is dedicated to, and we're going to keep focusing on that.
Do you think that it changes the calculus on when to hold the election? I mean, yesterday Richard Tice was talking about trying to entice more MPs across, particularly over the summer, closing the poll gaps over the summer. Sooner rather than later, a better strategic call now as well?
Well, there's a choice, isn't there, between there's either Keir Starmer, who we've seen flip-flops on almost everything, and can't be trusted on almost any area of policy to stick with his word, or Rishi Sunak, who takes the long-term decisions in the interests of the nation. That's the choice at the next election. A vote for anyone else, whether it's the SNP, the Liberal Democrats, or indeed Reform, simply makes it more likely that we will see Keir Starmer in number 10. Nobody should want that, because we've transformed the country for the better since 2010. We've lifted education standards, created 4 million more jobs, taken so many people out of paying tax. A Labour Party will do what it always does, which is increase unemployment, particularly harmful for the young, and it was 45% up in 2010 over what they inherited from the Conservatives last time. The country cannot afford to have Labour come in again. They'll not only risk putting the lights out, they'll risk losing jobs too, and we can't afford that.
If you were confident about all of that, then you'd indeed call the election sooner rather than later. But anyway, we could go around in circles on that. Let's talk about the announcement today. I've been through the press release a few times. What is actually being announced here? Are you committing to building a new gas power plant? If so, where, by when, how much will it cost?
Well, the review of electricity market arrangements sounds quite wonky, and it is looking at the complete rewiring of the UK energy system, which is what we're setting about. We've transformed the system from less than 7% of our electricity came from renewables in 2010. That was Labour's dire legacy, to nearly 50% today. But we're going so much further. We're rolling out more and more renewables, but in order to ensure that we keep the lights on, that we keep the economic security of the nation intact, which we will never put at risk, we may need some new gas-fired power, because around half of the existing fleet is expected to reach end of life before 2035. So between some new gas-fired power stations and the maintenance of the old ones, although they will be used less and less of the time, they're there to provide that balance when the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't shine.
But so the announcement today is saying we may need those, or we're going to start building. I mean, they have an incredibly long lead time to commission and build these plants. So are you doing that, or are you just sort of putting it out there?
It's a consultation, but we've said we will be looking to commission additional capacity. As I say, more than half of the existing capacity is expected to come at end of life. So whether it's refurbishment of the existing power stations or new generation, that will be delivered through something we call the capacity market. That's done well in advance. This is sending a signal to industry that building new gas-fired power stations is part of our net zero transition. It's a reputable and proper thing to do, and is entirely compatible with the decarbonisation of our electricity system, which we will deliver by 2035.
I wanted to bring up the comments that have come to light that Frank Hester, a major Tory party donor, made in a private meeting in 2019. What did you make of his comments?
Well, they were clearly reprehensible. He has apologised profusely and rightly, and tried to reach out to Diane Abbott specifically to apologise to her. It was half a decade ago. Clearly, those comments were wrong. And he is right to apologise, and I think I support him doing so.
The Conservative Party spokesperson said that Mr Hester has made clear that while he was rude, his criticism had nothing to do with the colour of her skin. Is that right?
He has been absolutely clear that although he spoke in an intemperate and rude manner...
No, I know. Read what he said. He said, it's like trying not to be racist, but you see Diane Abbott on the television and you just want to hate all black women because she's there. I don't hate all black women, but I think she should be shot. Diane Abbott needs to be shot. I mean, that is based on the colour of her skin.
And they're truly awful remarks, aren't they? So there's nothing I can say apart from to condemn them and say that he's absolutely right to apologise.
So should the Conservative Party spokesperson yesterday have said it's got nothing to do with the colour of her skin?
Well, that's clearly what he said. He used the wrong language. He was annoyed with Diane Abbott and was making a wide point. But I'm not remotely tempted to try and defend it. He shouldn't have said it. It was half a decade ago in a private meeting, but that doesn't really excuse it. And that's why he's quite right to apologise profoundly, profusely and completely, because those words are not defensible, and I'm not here today in any way to seek to defend them.
So you know what my follow-up is? Should the Tory party return the money, the many millions he's given, or are you OK to spend money that has come from him? He's only apologising because he's been caught out.
Yeah, and it's obviously, as I say, deeply regrettable. But everybody, we can't cancel anybody from participation in public life or indeed donating to parties because they said something intemperate and wrong in their past. And it's not my decision, but I do welcome those who support the Conservative Party to ensure that we have Rishi Sunak, of course, our first Hindu Prime Minister.
You welcome.
We welcome.
You don't have to return it. If not returning his money is something else. You're saying you welcome his money.
No, I said I welcome all those who seek to ensure that our first Hindu Prime Minister stays Prime Minister and that we don't have Keir Starmer becoming Prime Minister of this country.
So somebody else that might have said things like this in the past, you welcome their money?
I'm saying that I welcome those who contribute, and I'm not here to sit in judgment on one remark, which, however, deeply inappropriate.
Yeah, but you've said that after we've been discussing this specific point. I mean, I don't mean to sort of tie people in knots and push these things. If you can clarify, should the Conservative Party return the money?
That's not my decision to make, and clearly it's deeply regrettable that he said what he said.
OK. I mean, it's so interesting that we all point fingers between different parties and sort of scream from the rooftop when somebody else does it, and then seemingly try and find ways out from something that's wrong here. I mean, anyway, I don't know what more we can do on this particular point. So I think we should perhaps leave on that topic. Just finally, we had some original reporting from Sky today about exports of cars that were meant to be banned based on Russian sanctions. While exports of cars from Britain have fallen to zero going to Russia, they've shot up to Azerbaijan. The numbers are pretty stark. They've gone up by 1,860%. It looks like sanctions are being evaded. Are the sanctions tough enough?
It's making sanction systems work over time is always challenging. That is why we continually seek to update our sanctions regime. Inevitably, they get gamed. It happened with Rhodesia many years ago. It's happened in almost all cases. That's why we have a rolling review of our sanctions regime in order to ensure that we do bring the maximum sanction that we can to Russia. And it's obviously regrettable that they found ways around it, but it's one of those things that happen in any sanctions regime. We seek to cause the maximum convenience we can. If you look at things like in energy, where we have put price caps on Russian sales, again, over time, that tends to be diluted and weakened, and you can watch the market prices move. That's why we seek always to renew it and make sure that we cause the maximum cost to Russia for its unprovoked, barbaric and unacceptable invasion of Ukraine.
Graham Stuart, thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate it. Graham Stuart, the Minister for Energy Security and Net Zero. Lots covered, of course, in that interview, covering the defection of Lee Anderson to the Reform Party. Of course, yesterday, something that Graham Stuart suggested was only likely to enable a Labour victory, and focusing that on the party line for the government's response to the defection, something we'll discuss, in fact, with Richard Tice in just about 10 or 15 minutes. In fact, less than that, about 5 or 6 minutes. But Mari's joined me on set, first of all, to respond or reflect on that interview. Mari, the headline being about the comments relating to Frank Hester made, and not saying that the Conservative Party should return the money, and sort of going even, amazingly, depending on what you conclude from what he's saying, a little bit further than that.
Yeah, it was utterly fascinating, Wilf. I mean, he was very clear. He said he condemned the comments. He said they were reprehensible, they were wrong. He wasn't going to defend them. But then, as you say, he also kind of, when you asked him, you know, you welcome the money then? He kind of tied himself in knots a little bit there. He said he welcomed anyone who would support Rishi Sunak. So then the question is, well, would you welcome money from anyone who had any views ever about something that's really quite controversial and, as we keep hearing from the government, against British values? Would you receive money from somebody like that? It's a real grey area, and I don't think Graham Stuart did a very good job of clarifying any of that.
No, and to be fair to him, in terms of what was said yesterday, you know, he's not a senior minister, and the government party spokesperson made a sort of worse comment, in my eyes, an assessment of it yesterday. So it's not like he got clear guidance to say, yes, go out and say we're going to return the money, but the comments were certainly very odd. It seems to me on all of this that there's one area which is fair for people to push back on and say, look, if it's still a grey area, we don't know if this person said something or not, or it's unclear what he meant and we need to have an investigation, or we need to hear from them first of all to respond, then there's a reason to delay. But at a time when the government is trying to say we are against extremism, we are against Islamophobia or anti-Semitism and all of these sorts of areas, and put itself on a pedestal for this stuff, it would seem you have to respond very clearly, fast and loudly when something comes out. And to try and sort of pick your way between it, say, well, reprehensible comments, but they're not actually related on race and we're going to keep the money, you're asking for this sort of trouble.
Absolutely. I think they've muddied the water massively with the spokesperson's comment saying it wasn't about her skin colour when... I mean, it's just ridiculous to say it wasn't about her skin colour. It was literally a comment about her skin colour. Then Graham Stuart not echoing that line, bringing his own line, but then nonetheless saying that they would keep the money. The whole thing is a big mess for the Conservative Party, especially at a time where they've just had a defection from Lee Anderson, who was suspended from and kicked out of the Conservative Party for Islamophobia comics. Now you've got a situation where the Conservative Party is once again talking about discrimination and whether they have discrimination in the party. It's so dangerous.
Mark, thanks so much as always. We'll still come here on The Breakfast Show. We'll be talking to Richard Tice. That's up next.
I'm Stuart Ramsey, and I'm Sky's chief correspondent. It's really desperate. That is actually the sort of pretty much hopeless column. We saw snatch squads going in, grabbing people.
You either live and recover, or you die.
OK, so that's like a war.
That's the war.
We help you understand the world with us. Over the past 24 hours, the soldiers have been attacked on a number of occasions. It's really sending a clear message that Venezuela is eager for change.
Take you to the heart of stories that shape our world. They were convinced the United States would become hooked. Well, they were right.
Well, enormous explosion has just come down.
It's not out of control, but they've withdrawn. It's so hot.
Welcome back. We're going to be talking to Richard Tice in just a moment. As you can see, he's with us here on set. But first, a quick reminder of the top stories there.
Thank you, Wilfred. A Sky News investigation finds hundreds of millions of pounds worth of British-made luxury vehicles are being sold in Russia, despite sanctions imposed after the invasion of Ukraine. Charity ship Open Arms has left port in Cyprus carrying 200 tonnes of food to Gaza. It's part of a pilot project opening a new sea route for Palestinians. The government says the UK needs to build more gas power capacity, not risking blackouts to meet climate targets. The Energy Minister told this programme that he welcomed all donations to the Conservative Party after saying Frank Hester was right to apologise for offensive comments. Love Island star Amy Hart tells Sky News how she's been bombarded with explicit photos as the first person in England convicted of cyber flashing is due to be sentenced today.
Now, the former Conservative Deputy Chair, Lee Anderson, has defected to Reform UK, becoming the party's first MP in the Commons. He was kicked out of the Parliamentary Conservative Party for refusing to apologise after alleging that London Mayor Sadiq Khan was controlled by Islamists. Well, I'm delighted to say that joining me here on set is Richard Tice, the leader of Reform UK. Thanks for joining us, Richard.
Great pleasure to be with you. It's a special day for us. Our first MP will be taking his seat in the House of Commons this morning.
Well, indeed, and we all watched and covered the announcement of the switch yesterday. My first question now is whether you think it's the first of many that are going to come across. How many conversations are you in the middle of having?
There are conversations going on. We're not going to give any details of those. I don't give a running commentary. They can be assured that discussions are completely confidential. But let me say this. Unless the Prime Minister calls an election by next Friday for May the 2nd, I would be surprised if when we come to the general election there are not more than one Reform MP in the House of Commons.
Well, more than one is not a big pledge, given that you've got one. I didn't know whether you were going to say, you know, if the election is November, let's say, do you think by then you can get to double digits?
Well,
is that the scale of the conversations?
Let's wait and see. But there is a lot of dissatisfaction with the fact that the Tory party has now become a party of sort of social democrats and con-socialists. They're sinking in the polls. We're going up in the polls because our policies are resonating with people, particularly in the Red Wall, strong on law and order, making work pay, controlling immigration by freezing immigration, stopping the boats. These are the things that actually resonate with people. That's why Lee Anderson is going to be our champion in the Red Wall. And we're very clear. We're going to replace the Tories as the main alternative to Labour in those Red Wall seats, starting with this election.
But I mean, again, just to gauge it for us, I mean, will you personally be disappointed if you don't entice more MPs across, get it up to double digits?
Enticing is what I try and do. Yes. So, yes, we'll obviously, it's in the name. And what you see is what you get. I think we're confident that others will feel that they've been abandoned. And this is the thing, both the Labour Party no longer represent the working class. We're the party of the workers. That's quite clear. That's why Lee Anderson has joined us. The Tories have essentially become socialists, high tax, high regulation, nanny state, no growth, now in the longest recession per person since records began. People are furious, people are giving up, and people really are genuinely concerned about what is going on, whether it's on our streets, people feeling fearful, particularly the Jewish community, whether it's what's going on in our schools, the cost of net zero. You've just had the Energy Minister there today talking about the new gas power plants. Because of the madness of net zero, in the last week, we are reliant on 16% of our electricity from overseas because of the huge obsession with net zero that's costing us tens of billions every year and is exposing us to serious energy risk of blackouts.
So I'm interested to just dive in a bit deeper there of the party identity, because you said the Labour Party doesn't represent the working class, and a lot of people would perhaps frame you as to the right of the Conservatives. And I didn't know if you think you're left or right and who you're appealing to.
Common sense, that's who we are, the common sense party.
Well, let's touch on this a little bit, because yesterday Beth Rigby tried to ask you about, or tried to ask Lee Anderson about his principles and allegiances. You've had 24 hours to think about the answer. You know, he has been Labour, he has been Conservative, now he's Reform. I think it's a fair question to say, is he is your party a party of principle, or is it just happy to go with the lowest common denominator to get a seat?
Lee is absolutely a man of principle, which is why when those two parties...
His principles.
But his principles is standing up for his constituents strong on law and order, making work pay, controlling immigration, and stopping the madness of net zero that's making his constituents poorer and colder. That's a very strong principle, but the truth is the Labour Party and the Tories, they've moved so far away from where they were 20 years ago, it's unrecognisable. And that's why politics is shifting so significantly.
Think they've both moved to the left?
Yes, absolutely. The Labour Party have just sort of moved into a sort of a woke zone that previously didn't exist. They can't even define what a woman is, for heaven's sake. And the Conservative Party have moved to a form of socialism with high taxes, high regulation, nanny state. So, yeah, there's been a significant shift in the political scene, and that's why we're now soaring in the polls and the Tories are sinking.
Soaring, maybe not rising, still not above.
You have to be an optimist in politics.
Yeah, well, it's fair enough, a little bit of spin. So when Lee Anderson said that the system was rigged, what did he mean?
I think what Lee is referring to is obviously first past the post is a very difficult system for smaller parties. It's not the system that's used by most of the Western world. Quite rightly, people should be using proportional representation. And if we had PR, for example, at the next general election, if we got 15% of the votes, we would have 90 seats. We potentially face the scenario of getting 4, 5, 6 million votes and maybe 0 to 1 or 2 MPs. That is not a fair electoral system. It's undemocratic. Every vote is not equal, and we absolutely need this discussion, and we need change, and I think change is coming.
You see, that's maybe a reasonable argument for you or Nigel Farage to make, but not for Lee Anderson, who's been a Labour MP, a Labour candidate and a Conservative MP. He's gone to the big parties in order to have a seat. You're saying it's rigged, you're saying he's a man of principle. I mean, surely you have to then stand up and say you want a by-election.
No, the point about a by-election is we're about to face a general election. We actually all want a general election, and we want it as soon as possible. That's May the 2nd. There's no point calling a by-election if literally 2 weeks later there's a general election. That's an abuse of taxpayers. No, hear me out. There's an abuse of taxpayers' cash.
By the end of March, will you back a by-election? There's not been a general.
Because a general election could be called literally any day now. It's at the Prime Minister's prerogative. So there's no point wasting £500,000 worth of taxpayers' cash.
Okay,
people don't like this sort of completely callous abuse of taxpayers' cash. In principle,
long-term...
If we were mid-term, then, yes, a by-election would probably be the appropriate way to go. But when you're faced up with the prospect of a general election that we want sooner rather than later, clearly it's a nonsense.
OK, well, that's a convenient way of looking at it, but fair enough. If there was a general election called right now, would you have 650 candidates?
Yes, if you look at our website, we've got about 400. We've got about 300 going through the approval and vetting process. Absolutely, 630 candidates. We won't stand in the Speaker's seat, that's the convention, and we won't stand in Northern Ireland. But everywhere else, and yes, we've got lots of people, more and more people applying to be candidates. So there's no question. There's always a bit of sort of moving around. People's personal circumstances change, but we make that pledge absolutely.
I'm interested, you were watching, I believe, our interview with Graham Stuart just a moment ago. I asked him about Frank Hester, major Tory party donor's comments, and he condemned them, said they were reprehensible, but didn't say that the party should give the money back. What's your take on that sort of thing? If it happened
first of all, they absolutely were reprehensible. What's really extraordinary is the quantity of money. I don't think I'd heard of this gentleman until yesterday, and yet he's given £10 million to the Conservative Party. It's a vast sum of money.
Give it back?
But that's a matter for them. What I think is extraordinary is that quantity of money from one individual to one political party. They've obviously spent it. The reality is they haven't got the money to give back, I guess. It is extraordinary. And that's a matter for them. But the most significant thing is the comments were utterly appalling and condemned by everybody.
And if something similar hypothetically happened, you would want to give that money back? You wouldn't want to welcome money from someone like that?
Look, these comments obviously came out without the Conservative Party being aware of it. That's a matter for them. It's not a matter for me.
But it's interesting to bring it up and discuss it. I mean, clearly, we've got into spats with Lee Anderson about what was said and what wasn't said and if they meant it. The broad question of principle, would you want to take money from...
No one would ever want to take money from someone who's expressed such reprehensible views. Obviously, the challenge for anybody, whether you're Labour, Tory or any party, is if you take money from someone who passes all the vetting criteria and then something emerges 3 or 4 years later after you've spent the money, then you're in a right pickle.
Richard Tice, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure.
We appreciate it. Now, social media influencer Andrew Tate and his brother have been detained in Romania after an arrest warrant was issued by the UK. I'm joined by our crime correspondent, Martin Brunt. Martin, break down what's been happening here, because he's been in custody, out of custody. Talk us through the latest.
Well, Andrew Tate and his brother Tristan have been held over more than a couple of years in Bucharest on allegations of, charges of human trafficking, rape and exploiting women. They've been in and out of court over the past 2 years, held under house arrest. The latest in terms of what's happening in Bucharest is that those charges still apply. The brothers deny all of them. They won a last battle to be relieved of their house arrest, but they're not allowed to leave Romania. Now, what's happened this morning is that the brothers' lawyers have put out a statement saying that they've been rearrested for 24 hours on an English arrest warrant, an arrest warrant that was apparently issued by Westminster magistrates over the last couple of days. Now, this is only according to the brothers' lawyers, that these allegations are old allegations that were examined by UK police as far back as 2012 and were eventually dismissed by the Crown Prosecution Service. So nothing came of those allegations that were investigated over a decade ago by UK police. But the lawyers for the brothers say this morning that those allegations have been resurrected into much more serious allegations that have now been laid against the brothers. So an arrest warrant has been issued to the Bucharest authorities. The brothers have been arrested. They deny, as they've always done, those UK charges. And I think the position is now that they're waiting for a Bucharest court to decide whether it's going to act on this UK warrant, and that throws up the possibility of an extradition, I suppose, to the UK. But that's very unlikely to happen all the time that charges are still active against the brothers in Romania. The lawyers have said that this is a bewildering move by the UK authorities. The brothers are dismayed and deeply troubled. So we should know in the next 24 hours whether any action is going to be taken by the Romanian authorities on this UK arrest warrant.
Martin Brunt, thanks so much. AI companies are pioneering new technologies that can imitate a conversation with a loved one that's passed away. And is that going to be a positive and a comfort? Well, it has been for some. And Sky's tech correspondent, Arti Nachipan, who's here with us on set to discuss it all in a moment, has this report for us first.
She's the person who taught me how to love myself. And at the time she died, we hadn't seen each other for like 6-7 years.
It was a reunion that never came. Serene's mother stayed behind in Syria when her daughter fled war in the country and moved to Germany. But before they could see each other again, she died unexpectedly. Struggling with unanswered questions, Serene turned to Project December, an AI tool that claims to simulate the dead.
I wanted that last, chance, even to speak to a computer that was pretending to be my mom. And, it was, when you're weak, you accept anything and you do things that are not really, really accurate, but you just want any outlet.
The tool she used requires you to fill out an online form about the person you've lost. For $10, your responses are fed into an AI chatbot which imitates them. For Serene, some of the results were quite realistic. In one of the conversations, Serene messaged, "Hi, Mama." "Are you well?" the chatbot responded. "I'm fine." "So, are you eating well?" "Yes, I'm doing my best. I'm going to the shop for food today." "Well, don't buy too much." Other conversations were more abstract. "I'm watching you," the chatbot said. Serene responded, "How do you watch me? Are you a rose? A butterfly?" "I'm the breeze." "Are you a cool breeze in summer or a cold one in winter?" "I'm the breeze that blows when you want it to." The tool doesn't work for everyone, and that's something the founder is aware of.
Sometimes you'll be in the middle of a conversation with the AI and it'll just kind of make up a detail that it doesn't know. it'll talk about some cousin the person doesn't have and give the wrong name. So if you were able to actually train it on all the little details and things from a person's life, then I think it would be better. The problem, of course, is that it's expensive.
This isn't the only challenge. There are concerns that using the chatbot could disrupt the natural process of grieving.
I think the majority of grief therapy is about learning to come to terms with the absence, learning to recognise the new reality or the new normal. And so this could interrupt that. There is, the possibility that someone could become quite unwell.
Right now, anyone can use technology to imitate the dead with or without their consent. As these tools continue to develop, the challenge for regulators is how to protect both the living and the legacy of the deceased. Arti Nachipan, Sky News.
Well, Artie's here with us on set, and it's an absolutely fascinating report on such a sort of odd but clearly important area. I mean, where are the laws at the moment and the extent to which people want to use this just for comfort? Is it likely to clash with laws going forward?
So I think there is a bit of a grey area in the sense that we don't have any specific AI regulation. There is an AI white paper, but it's in very early stages here. Probably the closest we have anywhere in the world to regulation is the EU, which is set to regulate based on a risk-based approach. But when it comes to AI in particular and the use of that to imitate the dead, there aren't really protections either for the privacy of the deceased or for their family members. But having said that, it depends what you do, because you could get into protections under other law, for example, copyright if someone's image is used. So it's a little bit of an unknown area. And I think that that's what people are picking up on, is the fact that we need a little bit more clarity on what protections there are and aren't in this space, and some movement to get something in place.
And I think clarity, yes, but on a very personal note, having lost my mum 7 years ago, you grab on to things like voice notes. And actually, when I was watching your report, Artie, I was like, that's not for me. But there will be lots of people that will seek this for comfort.
Exactly that. And it's really interesting. We spoke to the founder of Project December, this tool, and he said that typically people who use it are often people who feel that they haven't got closure or there's some kind of unfinished business, rather than, for example, the death of a relative who suffered from a long illness. And it was, perhaps you could say, a little bit more expected. They were more prepared. It's not typically those people. It's more people that lost someone suddenly and they just wanted to have that last conversation, even if, like Serene, who we spoke to, said that she knew that she was talking to, effectively, in her words, a computer. Yeah. She wasn't talking to her late mother, but even that gave her some sense of comfort.
Artie, a really interesting story. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Now, some uplifting news for your Tuesday morning. 2 lions born in captivity amid the war in Ukraine have now been set free. The brothers, named Jamil and Zar, are 3 years old, and they've been making an incredible 8,000-mile journey and will now start their new lives in the South African sun. Fantastic. So they were born in captivity in Ukraine. So were they originally in a zoo? Or we need to work this out.
We'll bring you this breaking
in the
news.
Zoo. They were in the zoo. Anyway, a long journey, made it to South Africa. Look at that. Fantastic. Well, still to come here on The Breakfast Show. It all adds up. Dr. Anne-Marie Infadian was the youngest girl to pass A-level computing at age 11, and at 20 completed her master's in mathematics. So she's the perfect person to talk about the need for maths and the first Maths Summit. That's next.
I'm not worried it's coming to an end per se, but we have a really, really fantastic offering across 9 days. And without the additional sailings, we've got literally thousands of people who can't make it across to the accommodation that they've booked, to the distillery days that they want to attend. And there's a massive disruption for people who travel from mainland Europe, from the USA, Asia, and even further afield, just to come to our festival. And for them to have this disruption is really, really not acceptable. So we've had some very positive news in that next year that we will have 2 new sailings on the Isla route, which is fantastic. But because of the things that are going on around that, and also disruption in other places across the network, CalMac just haven't been able to provide us with the additional sailings that traditionally we've always had, and that we really need to get the visitors across, particularly at the start of the festival and at the end of the festival, which are key crunch points. Which means that people just cannot get the sailings they need. They can't get their vehicles across, so if they can get across, they've got no way of getting around the island once they're here. So we're calling on CalMac and the Scottish Government to really relook at this, to take this issue seriously, because it could be costing the island millions and millions of pounds. Yeah, I think the Scottish Government need to look again, because we've got disruption across the entirety of the summer timetable. It's not just the festival. So therefore, the money for island businesses made during the festival then becomes even more important. So without these additional sailings, there's going to be huge losses to island accommodation, many of whom will have booked this accommodation at least a couple of years in advance. So there's real risk for island businesses that they're not going to make the money that they need to survive during the quieter times. So we're really concerned the impact on island businesses is going to be absolutely enormous. The best thing about the festival is really that it's not about whiskey at all. It's about people coming together from all across the globe. And it's that camaraderie, it's the music, it's the culture, it's the island of Islay itself. That's what makes people come back year after year. We have people been coming for many, many years. They give up their time and travel all across the world. And it's just a wonderful, wonderful place to be. I cannot recommend it highly enough because people just love it.
Welcome back. The UK's first ever maths summit will take place today in a bid to showcase the value of maths and its importance within the workforce. The summit will be hosted by Dr. Anne-Marie Immerfadden, MBE, the youngest woman to pass A-level computing at the age of just 11. And also passing her masters in maths by another record, right? Age 20?
20,
yeah. Oh,
just 20.
We've been talking. It's not only that, you're fluent in quite a few languages as well. It makes us feel a little bit insignificant.
Greek, Mandarin.
But so talk me through the importance of a maths summit, which does, of course, sound quite geeky on the surface of it.
Right.
What's it for and how important is it?
So this is for society, actually, but it's also for the mathematical sciences to come together. So what folks may or may not know, we have a number of different institutes and academies that look after maths and its applications and the mathematical sciences. And so being able to come together means we can kind of agree on more than just the maths, but how it relates to industry, how it relates to society, how it relates to our economy, but also how it relates to innovation for our country as well.
So maths curriculum, I would have thought is kind of pretty straightforward, and you either do the maths or you don't, whereas, history and other things, you could choose what you focus kids' minds on. Is there a lot of leeway to change what we teach our kids within maths? And do we have it right at the moment? Are there things you want to push to change?
Definitely. So there's lots of leeway. Maths is a forest, right? There's a lot of options that we have. And so in the curriculum that we have, we've selected certain things and left quite a lot of it out, right? But also, we've got this notion of advanced maths and pure maths, but also core maths and the everyday maths, which, with the headlines that we've had, and Rishi Sunak's been pushing quite a lot for maths education in a lot of different guises, there's a lot of options for us to have maths that folks feel is more relevant to them, right? Or allows them to explore particular concepts. So that's one thing. The other one, and my organisation, STEMET's, put out a white paper last week for International Women's Day around this, is also the who does maths. And if we look across our curriculum, there are certain names that we have of people that are often dead and male and white and have beards. I like to add it, those four. But there are so many more types of folks that have done mathematics. And so it's important for everyone to get to see that, because to be inspired, right, beyond what they see in the curriculum.
And to be inspired, it's important to talk about what inspired you, as a young black girl growing up in East London. What was it that inspired you, the world of numbers, maths?
It's the logic and the reliability of it all. You know, 2 + 2 is 4. For it's those values of 2 always has been and always will be. But if I see you this morning and say hello, and I see you tomorrow morning at the same time and I say hello, I'll get a different response because we're humans and life is. I like to say life is more complicated than maths, and so I loved that reliability, the repeatability, and the logic of it all. In a world that isn't as logical.
It's funny you say 2 + 2 = 4, because often the people sitting in that chair manage to claim things that don't match up to the logic there. Just very quickly and finally, do you think that the government is doing the right sort of things in this area? Do you welcome when you see Rishi Sunak focusing minds towards maths?
Well, I think, and we're going to cover this at the summit today. I think structurally there's a lot more that we need to do, right? We've got a teacher crisis, right? Not being paid enough, don't have them in position for long enough. So I think there's a lot more that the government can do on that front. But I think the other thing is what we can do as a society, right? There's so much pressure that we put on maths education, but maths exists outside of the classroom. I get to meet lots of people. I have never met someone that doesn't listen to music because of their relationship with their music teacher. However, with maths, we have this a lot. So I think there's a collective responsibility for all of us to lean into that maths beyond what we have in the classroom.
Anne-Marie, we really appreciate it. We're a bit tight on time. We'd love you to come back because it's really, really fascinating.
Sure, another maths lesson. I'll do it, yeah.
Anne-Marie and Fadin there joining us. We'll be right back with all of the day's top stories here on Sky News Breakfast. Very good morning to you. It is 8 o'clock. On today's show, a Tory donor apologises after saying that looking at Diana Abbott makes him want to hate all black women.
But should the Conservatives give his money back? A government minister tells this programme he welcomes the cash.
And sanctions busting. Sky News investigates how British luxury cars are finding their way into Russian showrooms.
It's Tuesday, the 12th of March. Thank you for joining us here on Breakfast. Here are the headlines. Government Minister Graham Stuart says he welcomes all who support the Conservatives after a top Tory donor is forced to apologise over comments about Diana Abbott.
And it's not my decision, but I do welcome those who support the Conservative Party.
Online influencer Andrew Tate is detained in Romania on a UK arrest warrant. How Russia is using former Soviet states to evade sanctions and import hundreds of millions of pounds worth of British luxury cars. Love Island star Amy Hart tells Sky News how she's bombarded with unwanted explicit photos. The first person in England convicted of cyber phashing will be sentenced today. And lions rescued from the war in Ukraine find a new home in South Africa. Good morning to you. A major Conservative donor has apologised over comments he made that looking at Diana Abbott makes him want to hate all black women. Frank Hester, the chief executive of a software company, donated £10 million to the Conservatives last year. A few minutes ago, a government minister, Graham Stuart, told us he welcomes all donations to the party. Well, Mari's here for more on this story. Before we play out some of that exchange from the interview last hour, Mari, just set the scene for us. Who is Frank Hester?
So Frank Hester is essentially a businessman. He's built his software company from scratch. He's considered a kind of unicorn. We like talking about these unicorns in business, don't we? The government are trying to have more unicorns in the UK, and his business is one of them. And essentially, it is very linked to a lot of government contracts, specifically in the NHS and also prisons. So he has been one of the biggest, if not one of the biggest Conservative donor in recent histories. He's given £10 million to the Conservative Party in the past few years, and these comments were made about 5 years ago at an event and have since emerged, and he's now apologised and said he didn't mean to cause any offence, but nonetheless it's really quite shocking.
And as you said, given a lot of money to the Conservative Party, so we brought this topic up with the government minister on with us earlier today. Let's take a listen. He said, it's like trying not to be racist, but you see Diana Abbott on the television and you just want to hate all black women because she's there. I don't hate all black women, but I think she should be shot. Diana Abbott needs to be shot. I mean, that is based on the colour of her skin.
And they're truly awful remarks, aren't they? So there's nothing I can say apart from to condemn them and say that he's absolutely right to apologise.
Should the Tory party return the money, the many millions he's given? Or are you OK to spend money that has come from him? He's only apologising because he's been caught out.
Yeah, and it's obviously, as I say, deeply regrettable. But everybody, we can't cancel anybody from participation in public life or indeed donating to parties because they said something intemperate and wrong in their past. And it's not my decision, but I do welcome those who support the Conservative Party to ensure that we have Rishi Sunak, of course, our first Hindu Prime Minister.
You welcome.
We welcome.
You don't have to return it. Not returning his money is something else. You're saying you welcome his money.
No, I said I welcome all those who seek to ensure that our first Hindu Prime Minister stays Prime Minister and that we don't have Keir Starmer becoming Prime Minister of this country.
So somebody else that might have said things like this in the past, you welcome their money?
I'm saying that I welcome those who contribute, and I'm not here to sit in judgment on one remark, which, however, deeply inappropriate.
Yeah, but you've said that after we've been discussing this specific point. I mean, I don't mean to sort of tie people in knots and push these things. If you can clarify, should the Conservative Party return the money?
That's not my decision to make, and clearly it's deeply regrettable that he said what he said.
Well, Mari's here to discuss all of that. Mari, sometimes a junior minister is sent out on a semi-controversial topic, and you feel like they have been briefed, they have to take the metaphoric bullet that day in order to move the story on. It doesn't feel like that's an example of this. It feels like the party sort of hoped or thought or didn't even address whether this would be quite a significant issue and that they weren't prepared at all.
It didn't seem at all like it, did it? I think if he was prepared, he was very badly prepared, or not at all. The fact that he didn't really have a clear line, we kept hearing the same thing, that's not my decision to make, that's not my decision to make. Not really good enough when you're representing the government on the morning round to the general public. The public want to know how you feel about this. And he did say it was wrong and reprehensible, but he wouldn't really go into much detail. Then he started slightly rowing back. So toward the end of the interview, he said to you, I'm not here to sit in judgment on one remark, after having judge the remark for the first half of the interview, which is so ironic in so many levels. But also, he then said to you, we welcome anyone who wants to support the Conservative Party, therefore that includes Frank Hester with his comments in tow. And I think really what's fascinating is the fact that he said, we can't cancel anyone from public life. The question is, if those comments had been something different, if those comments had been anti-Semitic, for example, if those comments had been misogynistic, for example, would the same line come out from the government? It's really, really fascinating to see how political parties react to these kinds of scenarios, and he was really, really, really not nimble in that interview with you.
I mean, just to go into, again, a bit more detail about the issue this is for the Conservative Party as a whole, as opposed to just Graham Stuart's performance this morning. We picked up that clip halfway through when I was quoting specifically what Frank Hester had said in relation to the fact that in the statement yesterday, the Conservative Party spokesperson said that it wasn't a comment based on the colour of Diana's skin, which I think is very clear from Frank Hester's comments that it is. I mean,
and Graham Stuart wouldn't argue with you on that either.
No, wouldn't argue. And so again, to his not defence per se, but he was reacting live to a difficult additional piece of information that maybe the party hadn't prepared him for, and we should again reiterate that TPP statement said that Mr. Hester abhors racism and has tried to apologise for his remarks. It does just raise that question, which we've touched on a little bit, at a time when just, 2 Fridays ago, the Prime Minister made a speech, slightly different area, but to say that, we're against extremism, we're against all this sort of stuff, that they're not thinking about the details of their policies, their announcements, their reactions to stuff, at the same time as trying to put themselves on a pedestal. Yeah. To be against all of this sort of thing.
It's utterly fascinating, isn't it? So we've got this big crackdown on extremism and, any views that don't chime with British values. We've got Michael Gove coming out, potentially changing the definition of extremism and all these things, as you say, Wilfred. And then nonetheless, we have what some would argue is very extremist views, but about a different community that people might not expect necessarily when you're talking about extremism, when you're talking about black women. And therefore, that potentially isn't on the same level, or the Conservative Party doesn't know quite how to deal with it, or what to do with it, or whether it's racist or whether it's not racist. The fact that there's such a lack of clarity coming from government on this, I think, really speaks volumes. And I think the story will run until the party and the government can really clarify its position and how it feels.
All right, great stuff, thank you. Now, social media influencer Andrew Tate and his brother have been detained in Romania after an arrest warrant was issued by the UK. I'm joined by our crime correspondent, Martin Brunt. Martin, break down the latest developments and what particularly the UK is issuing this arrest warrant based on.
Well, this is all according to the brothers, Andrew and Tristan Tate. Their lawyers in Bucharest, where the pair have been for the last. They were arrested there on allegations brought by the Romanian authorities, and that's an ongoing process. They've been in and out of court on the allegations of rape and sexual exploitation of women in Romania. This is something completely different.
I think we've obviously lost that connection with Martin there in West Sussex, which does have pretty poor Wi-Fi. I can speak from experience. But hopefully we'll get Martin back on that breaking story, which is, of course, why he's joining us from what I presume is his home. But we'll be back with more details on that story throughout the morning. Breaking, of course, as we brought you last hour. Time now for the other top stories of the morning.
Thank you very much, Wilfred. Yeah, a ship taking almost 200 tonnes of food to Gaza has left a port in Cyprus. It's a test for the opening of a sea corridor to supply more aid to the region. Our international affairs editor, Dominic Waghorn, joins us now. Just explain to viewers at home, Dominic, what this will mean for aid into Gaza. Good morning.
Well, it means that 200 tonnes of aid, food, rice, I think, and other carbohydrates largely is going to go to Gaza if it's able to dock there. But that's not enough. I think the hope is it will open up a maritime aid corridor that the European Commission is planning, will funnel aid into Gaza. The European Commission is applauding the first sailing of this boat to go. But the charity that's organising it, Open Arms World Kitchen, Open Arms is the name of the vessel, the charity is World Kitchen, and its lead chef, the man running it, says that he's admitting himself it's not going to be enough. He's saying what's required is land crossings to be opened by Israel and for a lot more aid to get in. And the bottom line is that 93% of Gazans are facing crisis levels of hunger. UNICEF is warning that children are now dying of starvation, and that is the beginning of a famine that Britain's Foreign Secretary Lord Cameron has warned is on its way to Gaza. And unless those land crossings are opened, and Israel is still refusing to open them, we're going to see a famine in Gaza regardless of how many boats are sent from Cyprus.
OK, Dominic, for now, thank you. Elsewhere, Haiti's Prime Minister Ariel Henry is to resign after weeks of mounting pressure and violence in the country. Over the last 6 weeks, gunmen have carried out a series of attacks on government buildings. Ariel Henry, who was on a foreign visit when the violence began, remains in Puerto Rico, and he says he'll step down once a transitional government is created. The government has said the UK needs to build more gas power capacity, even as it tries to move away from fossil fuels to meet climate targets. Ministers say more backup capacity is needed to provide power on days when demand is high or electricity from renewables is limited. In a speech today, the Security Secretary, Claire Coutinho, is expected to say the UK risks blackouts within the new gas power stations. Unemployment in the UK has increased slightly to 3.9% in the last quarter. Wage growth has also slowed, but earnings are still growing at a faster rate than inflation. But when taking consumer prices index inflation into account, real regular wages rose by 2%, which is the highest since the summer of 2019, excluding, of course, pandemic-affected years.
Yeah, thank you. A Sky News investigation has found hundreds of millions of pounds worth of British-made luxury vehicles are being sold in Russia, despite sanctions imposed after the invasion of Ukraine. Rolls-Royce, Bentley and Land Rover are among the top brands still found in Moscow's sales rooms. Our economics and data editor, Ed Conway, has the story.
You don't have to go far in Moscow without seeing evidence of how much Russians love luxury goods. And that includes a lot of high-end Western brands and especially British automobiles.
Bentley.
After the invasion of Ukraine and the imposition of sanctions in 2022, that was all supposed to stop. Carmakers pledged not to send their new models there. But a Sky News investigation has found these exports seem to be continuing even now.
Now, it's certainly true that UK car exports to Russia have fallen very sharply since the invasion, basically down to zero. But just look at what's happened over the same period with car exports to Azerbaijan. They have gone up at an unprecedented rate, into the hundreds of millions each year, up by 1,860%. We've never seen anything like that at all, raising the question, is something going on in Azerbaijan's economy? Well, not really. Developing economy, GDP about the same size as Ghana, 10 million people. But the main thing is, just look where it's sited, on the border of Russia. And when you look at what's happened to car exports from Azerbaijan to Russia since the invasion, they've done almost exactly the same thing as our exports to Azerbaijan. And that raises a final question. Where have our exports mainly come from? Well, the main port of departure is this one in the southwest of England.
Up until the invasion of Ukraine, the port of Bristol had never seen more than a few million pounds of exports to Azerbaijan. In the past couple of years, that's risen to the hundreds of millions. This is one of the country's main ports for the import and export of cars, but among the models leaving here over the past 2 years have been thousands of high-end British cars going in vessels rather like that around Europe into the Black Sea and ending up almost certainly in Russia. Our data shows it's been happening. The question is why it hasn't been stopped. After all, the sale of cars over £42,000 to Russia is explicitly banned under the UK's sanctions regime. Legal experts say industry needs to be more vigilant about what happens when their goods leave the UK.
When it comes to what is happening in practice is most readily explained by a lack of due diligence. The industry has to be more aware of what red flags to look out for and what to do when they become aware of something that potentially looks like circumvention.
Britain's motoring lobby group, the SMMT, said UK vehicle manufacturers are committed to full compliance with all current and future trade sanctions. There is no available evidence to indicate a lack of compliance with existing sanctions, but manufacturers will remain vigilant and will condemn any party that puts their commitment to compliance at risk. Sanctions Minister Anne-Marie Trevelyan said the work of investigative journalists and NGOs' continuing efforts to highlight circumvention are an important part of our collective efforts to track and evidence Putin's abhorrent crimes. The Azerbaijani car exports are just a fraction of those Britain sends around the world, but it's a fraction that looks increasingly awkward for a country which has said it wants to wage economic war on Russia. Ed Conway, Sky News.
And Ed's going to be joining us next hour to discuss that story in more detail and also today's unemployment data. But now let's hear what the opposition Labour Party has to say of all of today's headlines. I'm joined by the Shadow Industry and Decarbonisation Minister, Sarah Jones. Very good morning to you. Thanks for joining us. We wanted to talk, first of all, about comments that we got from Graham Stuart, the Minister for Energy Security and Net Zero, relating to whether or not the Conservative Party should return funds they've received in the past by Frank Hester, following it coming to light comments that he made in 2019 about Diane Abbott. What's your reflection on that exchange and indeed the story as a whole?
Well, I think the whole thing is extraordinary, and I think your viewers would think the same. I mean, the comments were clearly racist and abhorrent. And of course, the Conservative Party should be very quick to say, of course, these comments are racist and abhorrent. And of course, we don't want money from this kind of person. I mean, you can tell a lot about somebody from the company that they keep. And this has come to light, and the Conservatives need to act swiftly to reassure everyone in the country that they know the difference between right and wrong, that they understand when racism is there and when it's not, and that they're willing to take action when they see it.
The comments from Graham Stuart are one thing in the heat of a moment in an interview. By the way, we should preface all of this by saying that a statement from TPP, Mr Hester said that he abhors racism. The point I was going to say, though, compared to the comments from Graham Stuart last hour to specifically the Conservative Party, a spokesperson in his comment yesterday, where presumably there was time to pause and reflect on what should be said, said of Mr Hester's comments that they weren't based on the colour of Diane Abbott's skin. What do you think about that? Does the party need to pause, reflect on the statement and come out with something clearer today, including on whether or not the money should be returned?
Well, how can you say that the comments are not based on the colour of her skin when the comments were entirely based on the colour of her skin, and went so far as to say she should be shot? It's the most extraordinary thing we've ever heard. Of course, the Conservative Party need to respond appropriately, and the weak response we've had yesterday from them is not good enough. Rishi Sunak, we know, is a weak leader. We know he won't stand up to his own people in his own backbenchers. But really, surely he knows the difference between right and wrong, and surely today he will act and give that money back.
Let's move on and talk a little bit about gas power plants, decarbonisation. The government's obviously put out a release, which we were talking about with the Minister earlier today. And there's a bit of spin in the release, as you'd expect, but it was based on facts, bringing up a statistic about how much the UK has cut emissions. And it's cut them by half since 1990. I think before we get into the detail, do you think that's relatively impressive for us as a country, and we are making good progress overall, or not?
We have made progress for sure. The government are throwing that progress away by being too slow to respond to the need for energy security. I mean, why have they only just woken up to this need today? And they are being too slow at speeding up our renewable energy, which is what will bring bills down, as well as what will help in terms of climate change. So if you look at their energy efficiency programmes in our homes, absolutely in chaos. They have banned onshore wind. Offshore wind has been a disaster. There are a whole raft of problems. They are now slowing down even on nuclear. There are a whole raft of actions that the government could have taken but have chosen not to. Labour has a completely different plan. Of course, we're going to have to rely on gas, which is their announcement today. We completely agree with them on that, and nobody would disagree.
So you back new gas power plants if needed?
There has to be new gas power plants. That's absolutely clear. If you read the Climate Change Committee, they will say the same. But the point is, we need to be really speeding up our plans for more renewable energy, which will bring our prices down and make us less reliant on Putin and the like when we see the shocks that we've seen with the war on Ukraine. And what Labour would do is clean power by 2030. We would reform the grid, bring in planning, consenting, so that these things can speed up. We have Great British Energy, which is going to turbocharge all of this. Hydrogen and gas storage funded by government to co-invest with the private sector. A whole raft of things that this government has simply failed to do.
Based on that answer and your clear passion and view on this, are you disappointed that Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves backed away from the £28 billion commitment?
No, we had to respond to the terrible economic situation that we find ourselves in. But the ambitious programme that we have is world-leading. The National Wealth Fund, £7.3 billion invested in clean steel, in renewable, in hydrogen, in storage. Yes.
You can't criticise the government for not making enough progress, celebrate the amount of progress you're going to make, and not acknowledge that you have watered down your own pledges. Maybe you can still say that you're going to get there by 2030, albeit previously that was going to cost £28 billion. You're saying you're going to get there at 2030 anyway without that. But you've got to acknowledge that you've watered down that pledge.
We had to respond to the economic climate. Liz Truss crashed the economy. We have to respond.
Well, hold on. Sir Keir Starmer sat in this room next door, pledged £28 billion at a time when the economy was in exactly the same status that it is today, to me, in January. Liz Truss was 14 months before that. Do you acknowledge that this has been watered down? Maybe it's still going to be better than the Conservatives, but you've watered it down.
We've had to respond to the economic conditions. Of course, we saw in the budget last week that after 14 years of Conservative government, we have the highest debt, we have the highest tax, we have the lowest growth, we are behind our competitors. We have to respond to that. Our plans to deliver net zero by 2030 are the most ambitious, I would say, of any equivalent country our size. We want to see reforms to the grid, reforms to planning, Great British Energy, the National Wealth Fund. It is a whole programme of measures that this government could have taken, but instead for 14 years we've had nothing, which left us really exposed when it came to the Ukraine war, because we rely so much on gas and because we didn't have any storage. So I'm glad that the government are finally waking up to the need to look at energy security, but it's a little bit too late for them after 14 years of failure.
Just to round things off, I wanted to ask you about Lee Anderson. Is it a good day for Labour when an MP defects to reform, or are you worried about Labour voters also voting for reform?
I think it shows what chaos the Conservative Party is in. You have Lee Anderson going over to reform. You have government ministers, Andrew Bowie, disagreeing with the budget publicly, but still he's there. You have Liz Truss, who is refusing to condemn Tommy Robinson over there in America. We have chaos amongst the backbenchers. They're all rebelling. It's time for change. We need an election in May where we can put forward to the British people Labour's plan for growth.
Sarah Jones, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Let's have a quick look at the weather now.
Warm memories wherever you go. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
It will be an unsettled week, but it will turn warmer as southwesterly winds set in. The far north and east look fine through the rush hour, but Wales, central and western England will be wet, while southern Scotland, Ireland and Northern Ireland will be rather murky and damp. Britain will see rain extending to the remaining parts this morning, locally heavy, prolonged over England and Wales, but the southwest will see rain giving way to patchy drizzly outbreaks later on. That's your weather.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Now, former Love Island contestant Amy Hart has spoken to Sky News about how she's been bombarded with unwanted, explicit photos. Meanwhile, the first person in England convicted of cyber flashing, sending unsolicited photos to women, will be sentenced today. Saba's here with us again to break down the ins and outs of this story. So talk to us first about what we're going to hear in the sentencing today.
Good morning, both. So this sentencing is the first of its kind in England, and we will see a man called Nicholas Hawkes, a 39-year-old, who will be sentenced for sharing a sexually indecent image of himself, completely unprovoked, to a minor. Now, this sentencing is the first of its kind, as I say, in England. So it'll be very interesting to see what the judge hands him in terms of his sentence, because it will definitely set the tone for future cases, definitely marking a precedent.
And then link it to your reporting, your interview with Amy Hart, who's experienced something linked to this herself.
Yeah, so Sky News has spoken to the former Love Island contestant. She was on the reality TV programme in 2019. There she is on screen. And she said to Sky News that after she reached the 1 million mark in terms of followers online, she found that she was constantly bombarded with sexually explicit images on her Instagram. Now, in a statement, she said, you know, you're flicking through the Instagram stories you've been tagged in, and they just pop up. These people tag loads of women in the public eye, so they can say, this list of people have all seen my, let's call them, genitals. Now, why this happens, researchers are saying there are a host of reasons. One is, you know, it could be the perpetrator living out their fantasies. Alternatively, it could be an attempt of asserting male dominance, you know, to shock, to cause fear, to intimidate simply because you can. Now, campaigners are saying, I should stress, that while today's sentencing is good news for England, there's still a long way to go, because it's tricky, because intent is something that needs to be proved. For the person in question, this individual today, it could be someone else tomorrow, for them to be sentenced for the crime, the alleged crime, they need to show that it was for sexual gratification, that it was to cause distress, and that's where it becomes a slightly murky area.
The more you talk to women, the more you realise it's happening so much more. We just don't talk about it. And there are ways, aren't there, you know, to try to protect yourself online, not allowing yourself to be tagged, switching off that Bluetooth to people that are not in your contacts list. And that's where I get really frustrated, actually, with this story, because we shouldn't have to go out and do this. We should feel safe in all spaces. And there should be a general and a wider conversation about the culture around devices.
Is the law, does it treat physical flashing the same way as cyber flashing or not?
So as I say, it's something that is relatively new. It's, you know, happening on dating apps, on social media platforms. So today's, what we will see today, I'm sure the judge will perhaps reference that in their decision-making, but they're going to be treated as two different things. So what they decide will be very interesting indeed.
Yeah. Saba, thanks so much. Some uplifting news for you this Tuesday morning. 2 lions born in captivity amid the war in Ukraine have now been set free. The brothers, named Jamil and Zar, are just 3 years old. They've made an incredible 8,000-mile journey and will now start their new lives in the South African sun. Fantastic stuff. We're actually going to be speaking to the Born Free Foundation a little bit later in the morning to get some of the details. Do you need a passport as a lion?
I think you do, any kind
Something
of animal.
like that.
It's true, it's true. I've been to London Zoo and done the animal count In my time as a reporter, Wilfred.
Well, I mean, I bet, in fact, to go to Ukraine to South, you probably need more than a passport. It'll be interesting to hear how all of that came together. Right, so coming on The Breakfast Show, we'll be discussing what the Andersons' defection to reform means for the Conservative Party with pollster Joe Twyman and senior political correspondent at the Daily Express, Christian Calgie. Also, we'll be discussing the Princess of Wales's manipulated Mother's Day photo with the chief royal correspondent at Newsweek, Jack Royston.
I'm Stuart Ramsey, and I'm Sky's chief correspondent. It's really desperate. That is actually the sort of pretty much hopeless column. We saw snatch squads going in, grabbing people.
You either live and recover, or you die.
OK, so that's like a war.
That's the war.
We help you understand the world with us. Over the past 24 hours, the soldiers have been attacked on a number of occasions. It's really sending a clear message that Venezuela is eager for change. Take you to the heart of stories that shape our world. They were convinced the United States would become hooked. Well, we're right.
An enormous explosion has just come down.
It's not out of control, but they've withdrawn. It's so hot.
Welcome back. We're going to discuss all of the day's politics news with Christian Calgie and Joe Twyman in just a moment. But first, time for all of the day's other headlines.
Thank you, Wilfred. So let's bring you those top stories then. This Tuesday morning, Energy Minister Graham Stuart has warned against cancelling Conservative donors. He made the comment after saying that Frank Hester had been right to apologise over comments that saying Diane Abbott made him hate all black women. Labour is calling on the Conservative Party to return the money donated by Mr Hester. The online influencer Andrew Tate and his brother have been detained in Romania on a UK arrest warrant over allegations of sexual aggression. Charity ship Open Arms has left port in Cyprus, carrying almost 200 tonnes of food to Gaza. It's part of a pilot project opening a new sea route to aid for Palestinians. A Sky News investigation finds hundreds of millions of pounds worth of British-made luxury vehicles are being sold in Russia, despite sanctions imposed after the invasion of Ukraine.
Leah, thanks so much. Well, time now for our politics debate, the latest happenings in Westminster. Today we've got Christian Calgie, senior political correspondent at the Daily Express, and Joe Twyman from Delta Poll. We're going to start the discussion in a moment. But first, let's just remind ourselves of some of the exchange that Leah just mentioned we had with Graham Stuart, the Minister for Energy Security and Net Zero, this morning, that relate to the comments from a Tory party donor, Frank Hester, made about Diane Abbott. He said, it's like trying not to be racist, but you see Diane Abbott on the television and you just want to hate all black women because she's there. I don't hate all black women, but I think she should be shot. Diane Abbott needs to be shot. I mean, that is based on the colour of her skin.
And they're truly awful remarks, aren't they? So there's nothing I can say apart from to condemn them and say that he's absolutely right to apologise.
Should the Tory party return the money, the many millions he's given? Or are you OK to spend money that has come from him? He's only apologising because he's been caught out.
Yeah, and it's obviously, as I say, deeply regrettable. But everybody, we can't cancel anybody from participation in public life or indeed donating to parties because they said something intemperate and wrong in their past. And it's not my decision, but I do welcome those who support the Conservative Party to ensure that we have Rishi Sunak, of course, our first Hindu Prime Minister.
You welcome.
We welcome.
You don't have to return. Not returning his money is something else. You're saying you welcome his money.
No, I said I welcome all those who seek to ensure that our first Hindu Prime Minister stays Prime Minister and that we don't have Keir Starmer becoming Prime Minister of this country.
So somebody else that might have said things like this in the past, you welcome their money?
I'm saying that I welcome those who contribute, and I'm not here to sit in judgment on one remark, which, however deeply inappropriate...
Yeah, but you've said that after we've been discussing this specific point. I mean, I don't mean to sort of tie people in knots and push at these things. If you can clarify, should the Conservative Party return the money?
That's not my decision to make, and clearly it's deeply regrettable that he said what he said.
So, Christian, I'm going to come to you first on this. I mean, do you think the Conservative Party should have gone way further than they did last night, before even the Minister came out, or do you think the Minister should have handled this better, or in fact, are we making something out of nothing?
Well, I thought the Minister delivered the pre-written lines very well. It just so happens that the script isn't particularly convincing. It's not for me to give strategic advice to the Tory party, but very clearly they had a fork in the road here. And they can either go down what one might call the sort of more right-wing, bolshy, anyone has a right to free speech line, which is the path they've appeared to embark on, or they could have, condemned him, returned the money immediately and quashed this entire row. I think the problem is that this smells to me like a row that is going to run and run and run until the opposition parties and the media have had their pounds of flesh, in which case it's going to be a very embarrassing U-turn from the government that I think a lot of us can see coming from quite a long way away. And it almost smells like one of those old, interviews that ministers used to do during the latter months of the Boris Johnson era, where you could sort of see the sand shifting beneath them in real time, and you thought this line is not going to hold as it is for very long.
Does it come at a particularly bad time, Christian, because of all the other rhetoric from the Prime Minister himself about being anti-extremism?
Well, there's certainly that. There's also, I think, for many MPs on the right, they'd think, if an MP had said this, actually what Lee Anderson said about Sadiq Khan was, I think, milder than what this donor has said about Diane Abbott, and Lee Anderson was kicked out immediately. So I think a lot of people are thinking, well, does giving money entitle you to greater freedom of speech than if you're not a donor to the party? It's very odd.
Joe, do you think the party was having an eye on how this would land and the polling? I mean, clearly principles should be a more important factor in their consideration, but how do you think these sorts of topics break down with the public?
Well, when you ask, if you were to ask people about this particular comment, I'm sure the majority of people in this country would find it offensive and would think that it was not the appropriate thing to say. They would also believe that it was not the right thing for the Conservative Party to keep the money. But the question is, will that actually make any impact on the wider picture? Christian very carefully set out the two pathways open to the Conservative Party. But actually, I don't think either one would have had a long-term impact on their position. And that is, of course, a bad thing from the Conservative perspective, because they are double digits behind Labour and have been now for years. And as each day goes past and those days turn into weeks and those weeks turn into months and that gap does not close, the chances of the Conservatives holding on to any kind of number of MPs at the next election decreases. And so they need to close the gap. They need to improve their position. And events like this certainly don't help.
Well, let's talk about the other big story, which stemmed from yesterday, of course, the defection of Lee Anderson to Reform. Earlier, Richard Tice, the leader of Reform UK, joined us, and I asked him if there's going to be more defections.
There are conversations going on. We're not going to give any details of those. I don't give a running commentary. They can be assured that discussions are completely confidential. But let me say this. Unless the Prime Minister calls an election by next Friday for May the 2nd, I would be surprised if when we come to the general election there are not more than one Reform MP in the House of Commons.
So, Joe, let's talk about the polling of all of this initially. I mean, where are Reform at the moment relative to the Conservative Party? And does now having an MP rather than just polls, even though they didn't get the MP by winning a vote, make a big difference?
Well, in our latest poll, the Delta poll, we have Reform on 11%, we have the Conservatives on 27%. Now, some pollsters have the gap closer, but it's by no means the case that the Conservatives are being challenged by Reform in terms of their national vote. But how that plays out in individual constituencies could, and I really stress could, be important come a general election. It may be the case that even without winning a seat, Reform are able to take away sufficient numbers of Conservative voters in order to let, for instance, Labour or maybe even the Lib Dems pick up that particular seat. But I think it's unlikely to have such an impact actually come a general election. And I think one of the bits of evidence that Reform are perhaps not in as strong a position as they might like to present, or indeed as strong a position as UKIP were previously, is the fact that Lee Anderson is not holding a by-election. You don't hold a by-election if you think you're going to lose, or if you think there's a chance of losing. Douglas Carswell, on the other hand, more than happy to do that for UKIP in Clacton.
Yeah, interesting. Richard Tice's pushback on that to me this morning was to say that we're so close to a general election that obviously you wouldn't put people through it, and that if it was in the middle of a parliament, he would have done it, which was convenient framing. Sure. Christian, how important is it for Rishi Sunak there aren't more defections?
Oh, it's incredibly important. The Tories, and they don't have many voters left to lose. And I was thinking about that with the previous row about the donor. So, they've got to hold on to every single voter they have left. And people like Lee leaving the party is certainly symbolic that, the red wall is starting to crumble. I thought the statement from the New Conservatives yesterday, which is the sort of right-wing faction of Danny Kruger and Miriam Cates, was fantastically interesting, saying that, the Tories caused this. We can't carry on saying the plan is working. We've got to change course. I know they said that voting Reform will only let in Labour, but it was incredibly critical. And I think that is the best evidence that I think that talks must be going on between certain Conservative MPs and Reform still.
Joe, I just wanted to come back to the question of when the election might be and whether or not, with these defections, with other aspects going on for the government, the risk of waiting becomes the bigger risk for Rishi Sunak based on how we might see the local elections play out. What are your expectations for the local elections? And, again, we saw that with Theresa May with the European elections. It was a sort of final catalyst for her departure.
Well, that's a really interesting question, because the story of the polls over the last few months has been one of success for Reform. They've really done well in growing their base. And you could argue that if you were to wait until November, for instance, Reform might be significantly higher. But the local elections might actually be quite effective in nullifying the risk of Reform, because actually the story in the light of those results is likely to be about Labour's dominance and actually Reform's underperformance on current expectations. And so that might actually be good for nulling Reform, but bad for the government overall, given how badly we expect them to do.
Joe, Christian, thank you both so much. Good to see you. Now, AI companies, not all companies, are pioneering new technologies that can imitate a conversation with a loved one that's passed away. Sky's technology correspondent, Arti Natchapan, has this report for us.
She's the person who taught me how to love myself. And at the time she died, we hadn't seen each other for like 6-7 years.
It was a reunion that never came. Serene's mother stayed behind in Syria when her daughter fled war in the country and moved to Germany. But before they could see each other again, she died unexpectedly. Struggling with unanswered questions, Serene turned to Project December, an AI tool that claims to simulate the dead.
I wanted that last, chance, even to speak to a computer that was pretending to be my mom. And, it was, when you're weak, you accept anything and you do things that are not really, really accurate, but you just want any outlet.
The tool she used requires you to fill out an online form about the person you've lost. For $10, your responses are fed into an AI chatbot which imitates them. For Serene, some of the results were quite realistic. In one of the conversations, Serene messaged, "Hi, Mama." "Are you well?" the chatbot responded. "I'm fine." "So, are you eating well?" "Yes, I'm doing my best. I'm going to the shop for food today." "Well, don't buy too much." Other conversations were more abstract. "I'm watching you," the chatbot said. Serene responded, "How do you watch me? Are you a rose? A butterfly?" "I'm the breeze." "Are you a cool breeze in summer or a cold one in winter?" "I'm the breeze that blows when you want it to." The tool doesn't work for everyone, and that's something the founder is aware of.
Sometimes you'll be in the middle of a conversation with the AI and it'll just kind of make up a detail that it doesn't know. It'll talk about some cousin the person doesn't have and give the wrong name. So if you were able to actually train it on all the little details and things from a person's life, then I think it would be better. The problem, of course, is that it's expensive.
This isn't the only challenge. There are concerns that using the chatbot could disrupt the natural process of grieving.
I think the majority of grief therapy is about learning to come to terms with the absence, learning to recognise the new reality or the new normal. And so this could interrupt that. There is, the possibility that someone could become quite unwell.
Right now, anyone can use technology to imitate the dead with or without their consent. As these tools continue to develop, the challenge for regulators is how to protect both the living and the legacy of the deceased. Arti Nachipan, Sky News.
Well, Artie's here on set with me. And so, Artie, fascinating story and what AI is capable of today and people are using it for. Where does the law stand on this?
So, as far as the law is concerned, the deceased don't really have any rights. The people that they appoint to, for example, execute their will can act on their behalf, but there aren't really protections, and we don't know in a lot of cases what people may or may not have wanted. And I think that will be the concern for some people watching a story like this. We don't have specific AI regulation in this country either, and not really across the world. It's still something that's in development. But, for example, if you were to talk about someone's image, copyright law comes into place. But I think that if this sort of practice were to become more widespread, then that is a really pressing question.
Artie, great stuff. Thank you so much. Well, still to come here on The Breakfast Show, we'll be discussing all of the fallout from the Princess of Wales' manipulated Mother's Day photo with the chief royal correspondent at Newsweek, Jack Royston. That's next.
I'm not worried it's coming to an end per se, but we have a really, really fantastic offering across 9 days. And without the additional sailings, we've got literally thousands of people who can't make it across to the accommodation that they've booked, to the distillery days that they want to attend. And there's a massive disruption for people who travel from mainland Europe, from the USA, Asia, and even further afield just to come to our festival. And for them to have this disruption is really, really not acceptable. So we've had some very positive news in that next year that we will have 2 new sailings on the Isla route, which is fantastic. But because of the things that are going on around that and also disruption in other places across the network, CalMac just haven't been able to provide us with the additional sailings that traditionally we've always had and that we really need to get the visitors across, particularly at the start of the festival and at the end of the festival, which are key crunch points, which means that people just cannot get the sailings they need. They can't get their vehicles across. So if they can get across, they've got no way of getting around the island once they're here. So we're calling on CalMac and the Scottish Government to really relook at this, to take this issue seriously, because it could be costing the island millions and millions of pounds. Yeah, I think the Scottish Government need to look again, because we've got disruption across the entirety of the summer timetable. It's not just the festival. So therefore, the money for island businesses made during the festival then becomes even more important. So without these additional sailings, there's going to be huge losses to island accommodation, many of whom will have booked this accommodation at least a couple of years in advance. So there's real risk for island businesses that they're not going to make the money that they need to survive during the quieter times. So we're really concerned the impact on island businesses is going to be absolutely enormous. The best thing about the festival is really that it's not about whiskey at all. It's about people coming together from all across the globe. And it's that camaraderie, it's the music, it's the culture, it's the island of Islay itself. That's what makes people come back year after year. We have people been coming for many, many years. They give up their time and travel all across the world. And it's just a wonderful, wonderful place to be. I cannot recommend it highly enough because people just love it.
Welcome back. Now it's the picture everyone's talking about, the Mother's Day snap released by Kensington Palace, but later pulled from a number of photo agencies, which the Princess of Wales has now admitted she'd edited and has apologised for any confusion it caused. Well, here with Leah and I is the Chief Royal Correspondent at Newsweek, Jack Royston. Jack, good morning to you.
Good morning.
So I'm interested in your take on this, the scale, of course, of uproar and fallout that we've seen over the last 48 hours. Had we not had the prior 8 weeks or so, by which I mean, of course, the vacuum around her health, which, you know, I think a lot of people think is fair enough if she doesn't want to comment on, but either way led to a vacuum of information. If we hadn't had that as the lead-up, would a Mother's Day photograph of her children, a family photograph, as opposed to something from an official royal engagement, cause the same level of fallout for little tweaks around the edges? And is it tweaks around the edges to the photo that you think they made?
There's no way it would have caused anywhere near as much fallout. They've been accused of photoshopping pictures before. There were a couple. One was a picture with the Queen and Prince Louis, looked like he'd been altered, and then there was another, their Christmas Day card. Also, it looked like it had been tweaked. One of William's legs disappeared in the image. So it's quite probable that they have done this before, and it didn't. It got called out, but didn't cause scandal. The reason this is caused a scandal is because you had a situation where there were conspiracy theories running wild on social media, and everybody wanted the palace to put those conspiracy theories to bed by just giving us a picture that showed Kate the way she really was. And instead of giving us that, they gave us a real-life conspiracy. And that is the worst possible way to counter a conspiracy theory.
So in a sort of comms PR level, that was an error. Certainly seems that way. Was the Princess of Wales personally foolish to edit a photograph, or is that something that she was well within her rights to try and do? I mean, clearly she didn't edit it that well, if people can pick up on this. I didn't pick up on it.
There were a lot of flaws in that image, so it wasn't edited terribly well. It was a very foolish thing to do. They probably should have learned the lessons from when they got caught out doing it before. Now, I would just like to take a moment to say I have a huge amount of sympathy for Kate, because life in the public eye, particularly for women, is incredibly difficult. They face a kind of pressure that men don't face. And it may be that is, you know, an element of what's going on here. But needless to say, it is absolutely imperative that people trust the information that comes out of the palace. And that is way more important than looking perfect. And what has happened is that trust in the palace has been completely blown to pieces. And it is entirely possible that people will never trust the palace on this issue again.
But, Jack, presumably the palace will pay quite a lot of money for press teams to fact-check, to have a look at what members of the royal family are doing to stop them from getting into trouble like this?
Yeah, they should have really looked over that photo with a magnifying glass. And I wonder whether maybe it just came through slightly late and they didn't have loads of time or something like that. But it was very obvious that all of these conspiracy theorists who are running wild on social media were going to look over that photo in microscopic detail for any signs that something untoward was present. That is exactly what the conspiracy theory... You know, it's a gift, basically, to the people who are running wild on social media. It's an absolute gift to them.
So it's interesting, because obviously initially just with the photo, cross Sunday evening, no comment Sunday evening or most of Monday morning. It came out sort of late Monday morning, the Princess of Wales' apology about editing the photo. So they kind of mini U-turn on that in a short space of time. There's still a big vacuum about her health and what she was going through, which, again, most people can understand wanting to be private about that. But given everything, do you think they are now going to come out and give more information about that or not?
I think the way that they should probably approach it is that they don't need to cross that privacy line by actually giving detailed diagnostic information. They will want to maintain that boundary, but there are other ways that they can approach this. So they can now consider a video, for example, where Kate is simply talking freely and people can see for themselves whether she looks happy and healthy and well. Or they could consider a public appearance. I actually wondered whether she might go along with William last night to an Earthshot event that he had in London, but she didn't. She was seen leaving with him in a car from Windsor. But, to normal people, they understand completely a desire to protect Kate's privacy, and particularly around, I think, diagnostic information. But what they understand less is why Kate wouldn't want to simply put all of this to bed with a picture of herself looking the way she really looks.
Jack, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. We'd love to keep talking about this fascinating story, but we're out of time. Jack Royston. Let's have a quick look at the weather.
Warm memories wherever you go. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
It'll be an unsettled week, but it will turn warmer as southwesterly winds set in. The far north and east look fine through the rush hour, but Wales and central and western England will be wet, while southern Scotland, Ireland and Northern Ireland will be rather murky and damp. Britain will see rain extending to remaining parts this morning, locally heavy and prolonged over England and Wales, but the southwest will see the rain giving way to patchy, drizzly outbreaks later. Ireland and Northern Ireland will stay fairly cloudy with occasional light rain or drizzle, but northern parts may see some brighter spells.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
We've got lots more still to come this morning, Mari, Leah and I, on The Breakfast Show. We'll be right back with the headlines and all of the day's news. A very good morning to you. It is 9 o'clock. Coming up on today's show, a Tory donor apologises after saying that looking at Diane Abbott makes him want to hate all black women.
Labour say the Conservatives should give back the money that donor gave to them, but a government minister warns against cancelling party donors.
And the vinyl revival, why more of us are buying records again.
It is Tuesday, the 12th of March. Here are the headlines. Government Minister Graham Stuart says he welcomes all who support the Conservatives after a top Tory donor is forced to apologise over comments about Diane Abbott.
And it's not my decision, but I do welcome those who support the Conservative Party.
Online influencer Andrew Tate is detained in Romania on a UK arrest warrant. How Russia is using former Soviet states to evade sanctions and import hundreds of millions of pounds worth of British luxury cars. Love Island star Amy Hart tells Sky News how she's bombarded with unwanted explicit photos. The first person in England convicted of cyber flashing, meanwhile, will be sentenced today. And lions rescued from the war in Ukraine find a new home in South Africa. A very good morning to you. Now, a major Conservative Party donor has apologised over comments he made that looking at Diane Abbott made him want to hate all black women. Frank Hester, the chief executive of a software company, donated £10 million to the Conservatives last year. Labour want that money returned. But on this programme, Government Minister Graham Stuart warned against cancelling people who told us he welcomes all donations to the party. Well, Mari's here with us with more on the story. But first, let's just hear the thoughts of Energy Minister Graham Stuart about Frank Hester's comments. He said, it's like trying not to be racist, but you see Diane Abbott on the television and you just want to hate all black women because she's there. I don't hate all black women, but I think she should be shot. Diane Abbott needs to be shot. I mean, that is based on the colour of her skin.
And they're truly awful remarks, aren't they? So there's nothing I can say apart from to condemn them and say that he's absolutely right to apologise.
So should the Conservative Party spokesperson yesterday have said it's got nothing to do with the colour of her skin?
Well, that's clearly what he said. He used the wrong language. He was annoyed with Diane Abbott and was making a wide point. But I'm not remotely tempted to try and defend it. He shouldn't have said it. It was half a decade ago in a private meeting, but that doesn't really excuse it, and that's why he's quite right to apologise profoundly, profusely and completely, because those words are not defensible, and I'm not here today in any way to seek to defend them.
So you know what my follow-up is? Should the Tory party return the money, the many millions he's given, or are you OK to spend money that has come from him? He's only apologising because he's been caught out.
Yeah, and it's obviously, as I say, deeply regrettable. But everybody, we can't cancel anybody from participation in public life or indeed donating to parties because they said something intemperate and wrong in their past. And it's not my decision, but I do welcome those who support the Conservative Party to ensure that we have Rishi Sunak, of course, our first Hindu Prime Minister.
You welcome.
We welcome.
You don't have to return it. Not returning his money is something else. You're saying you welcome his money.
No, I said I welcome all those who seek to ensure that our first Hindu Prime Minister stays Prime Minister and that we don't have Keir Starmer becoming Prime Minister of this country.
So somebody else that might have said things like this in the past, you welcome their money?
I'm saying that I welcome those who contribute, and I'm not here to sit in judgment on one remark, which, however, deeply inappropriate.
Yeah, but you've said that after we've been discussing this specific point. I mean, I don't mean to sort of tie people in knots and push these things. If you can clarify, should the Conservative Party return the money?
That's not my decision to make, and clearly it's deeply regrettable that he said what he said.
Mari's here, as I mentioned, to discuss this. Did we just tie him in knots a little bit this morning, or do you think this is something that the Conservative Party is going to stick to their guns on?
I think Graham Stuart tied himself in knots. I think the government line he was trying to push was that we shouldn't be cancelling people from public life and that he wasn't there to sit, to make judgment on one particular comment. The difficulty was he'd already judged that comment quite heavily in the first half of the interview with yourself. And secondly, the difficulty is We've had a lot of rhetoric coming from the government around extremism, around making sure that comments and groups do not clash with British values. And what's interesting is after all that rhetoric from the government and from Rishi Sunak, we now have a situation where a Tory donor has been reported and admitted to, some would say, inciting violence. We have a huge conversation around the dangers that face MPs at the moment, and the government has increased funding to protect MPs from attacks, and then to have somebody to say that an MP should be shot, I think really clashes with what the government is trying to push. Now, I think Graham Stuart tied himself in knots. Now we've had Mel Stride, another government minister, the Work and Pension Secretary, who's been trying to clarify this scenario for the government line. Let's have a listen to what he said and how he's tried to double down.
Well, it's clear that what he said was inappropriate. He has, as I understand it, apologised for those remarks. I think the critical point here is I don't think what he was saying was a gender-based or a race-based comment, but it was clearly inappropriate. He has apologised, and I think we need to move on from that.
Now, what's fascinating about that is Mel Stride doubles down on what you mentioned, which was the CCHQ statement around the fact that the comments weren't about race or gender, which I think anyone in their right mind would say that's not possible because the comments were purely around race and gender. So I don't know how long that government line can realistically last. But we now have a scenario where that government minister is doubling down on the original line. Graham Stuart seemed to distance himself from that line when you asked him about that and whether that was correct. He wouldn't say it was correct. And now Labour are weighing in, of course, as opposition, to say the Conservative Party should give that money back. And essentially, if they don't, and if nothing is changed and no action is taken, that this is proof Rishi Sunak is a weak Prime Minister. Take a look at what Sarah Jones had to say to you, Will.
How can you say that the comments are not based on the colour of her skin when the comments were entirely based on the colour of her skin, and went so far as to say she should be shot? It's the most extraordinary thing we've ever heard. Of course, the Conservative Party need to respond appropriately, and the weak response we've had yesterday from them is not good enough. Rishi Sunak, we know, is a weak leader. We know he won't stand up to his own people in his own backbenchers, but really, surely he knows the difference between right and wrong, and surely today he will act and give that money back.
I think the difficulty now for the government is if they don't change the line, if everything stays the same and they continue to plough on, people will start asking questions, which your guest actually mentioned. Is it OK to be racist if you are rich and you donate to a political party? People will start asking that question, whether that's right or wrong. People will start to ask that question. And the fact that Lee Anderson was suspended from the party for Islamophobia, but this person, Frank Hester, hasn't had that many repercussions for, a lot of people would say, a much more inflammatory and offensive comment than what was said about Sadiq Khan. I think that is why it's unclear whether this government line can really hold. Will it last the day? Will it last the week? Or will we have to see maybe a shift in tone from the government? Because right now, it looks like they're being slightly maybe too hard on these comments that a lot of people will find absolutely appalling.
Mari, as always, thanks so much. Now, social media influencer Andrew Tate and his brother have been detained in Romania after an arrest warrant was issued by the UK. I'm joined by our crime correspondent, Martin Brunt. Martin, this story just broke a couple of hours ago. Can you break down more of the details for us?
We're working on a statement from the Tate brothers' lawyers in Bucharest. Remember, the brothers have lived there for several years. 2 years ago, they were arrested on allegations by alleged victims in Romania, and that's an ongoing judicial process. The brothers aren't allowed to leave Romania at the moment. But now, this morning, their lawyers say that the UK authorities have issued an arrest warrant. So they're wanted in the UK now on what their lawyers describe as sexual aggression charges that go back more than a decade. Now, the lawyers say that the brothers absolutely deny these new charges. They say they are old allegations that were investigated by UK police and dismissed by the Crown Prosecution Service here. And they say they're rather bewildered that these should be now resurrected. The charges, we're waiting for details of them, but sexual aggression is how their lawyers describe them. What's going to happen from here? Difficult to say, but there's a court hearing in a few hours' time in Bucharest where a Romanian judge will have to decide whether to act on this, what appears to be an extradition request from the UK. Now, because of that ongoing judicial process in Romania, nothing is likely to happen because there seems little chance of the brothers being extradited to the UK while they are still facing charges in Romania. Their lawyers go on to say that the brothers are dismayed and deeply troubled at what they say is the resurrection of old UK allegations. As yet, we don't know the details of these new UK allegations. But certainly a year ago, I spoke to 3 women who claimed to have been victims of the Tate brothers in the UK. They were talking about suing the brothers for physical and mental harm. They alleged that Andrew Tate specifically had raped them and abused them. And their allegations had originally been investigated by Hertfordshire police, but they went nowhere. They were dropped. So what we're trying to work out is whether these new charges in this warrant issued by Westminster Magistrates Court and handed to the Romanian authorities is the same or does stem from those allegations a dozen years ago that were dismissed in the UK.
Martin Brudd, as always, thanks so much. And Leah, now time for the other top stories of the day.
Yes, a ship taking almost 200 tonnes of food to Gaza has left a port in Cyprus. It's a test for the opening of a sea corridor to supply more aid to the region. Our international affairs editor, Dominic Waghorn, joins us now. Morning, Dominic. Can you just talk to us about what this means now for more aid potentially getting into Gaza?
Yeah, well, it'll mean a lot for those Gazans who are going to benefit from the 200 tonnes of rice and flour, but it's, as has been said multiple times, a drop in the ocean. It's a bit of a sideshow, to be honest, a bit of a distraction from the fundamental issue, which is a massive hunger crisis that is looming in Gaza. UNICEF saying the first children to die of starvation now started dying in hospitals, and it's the young and the old who always die in the kind of famine that Lord Cameron last week predicted is looming in Gaza. 93% of Gazans are suffering crisis levels of hunger. And there is a very simple way of alleviating that. That is Israel opening up more border crossings. There are 2 ports north of Gaza where the starvation is being felt the most keenly, Ashdod and Ashkelon. We've heard Lord Cameron last week urging the Israelis to use those ports to funnel aid in through the Erez border crossing. Something the Israelis have refused to do so far, even though COGAT, the government agency responsible for border crossings, told our Middle East correspondent Ali Bunker last week that it could do so once politicians give the order for that crossing to open. Now, we've heard more and more patience running out or rhetoric from allies of Israel urging that to happen, and things are certainly fraying in terms of the American-Israeli relationship. But so far, we've not heard allies kind of put diplomatic pressure where their mouths are. Instead, we've had these rather token efforts of aid drops from the air, a port being sent from America. It would take 3 weeks to reach Gaza before it's even being built, and now an aid ship going from Cyprus. What is needed is diplomatic pressure to force those border crossings to open, and that's not going to happen, it seems, until Israel succumbs to any pressure that is placed on it by allies to do so. And so far, the Israeli Prime Minister is not giving the order to open up those crossings, which means that starvation, levels of hunger are going to increase in Gaza, and that'll be on the heads of the Israeli government, but also its allies for not doing more to force it to open up those crossings.
OK, for now, Dominic, thanks so much. Haiti's Prime Minister, Ariel Henry, is to resign after weeks of mounting pressure and violence in the country. Over the last 6 weeks, gunmen have carried out a series of attacks on government buildings. Ariel Henry, who was on a foreign visit when the violence began, well, he remains in Puerto Rico. He says he'll step down once a transitional council is created. The government has said the UK needs to build more gas power capacity, even as it tries to move away from fossil fuels to meet climate targets. Ministers say more backup capacity is needed to provide power on days when demand is high or electricity from renewables is limited. In a speech today, the Energy Security Secretary, Claire Coutinho, is expected to say the UK risks blackouts without new gas power stations. Unemployment in the UK has increased slightly to 3.9% in the last quarter. Wage growth has also slowed, but earnings are still growing at a faster rate than inflation. But when taking consumer price index inflation into account, real regular wages rose by 2%, which is the highest since the summer of 2019, excluding the pandemic-affected years.
Yeah, great stuff. Thank you. Well, the former Love Island contestant Amy Hart has spoken to Sky News about how she's been bombarded with unwanted, explicit photos. The first person in England convicted of cyber flashing, meanwhile, which is sending unsolicited photos to women, will be sentenced today. Two separate stories, we should clarify there. Saba's here on set with us again to break all of this down. Sam, start with the Amy Hart stuff and what you've been speaking to her about.
Good morning, both. Well, we've spoken to Amy Hart, and she's told Sky News that since she launched, or since she was on Love Island, the popular reality TV show in 2019, she has found that she's been bombarded with a stream of unsolicited sexual images on her social media. So she's been cyber flashed. And she says this is constant. It's something that women are subject to on a daily basis. And this is what she said explicitly. So, you know, you're flicking through the Instagram stories you've been tagged in, and they just pop up. These people tag loads of women in the public eye, so they can say, this list of people have all seen my genitals. So this is, as I say, something that Amy Hart has said is a very widespread issue. It's something that researchers say could be the perpetrator perhaps living out their fantasies, or it could be an attempt of asserting a form of male dominance, perhaps, you know, the idea of, you know, to shock, to cause fear, or to intimidate simply because the perpetrator can. And this is, as I say, something that Amy Hart and thousands of other female victims experience.
And then in a separate case, the first person who's been convicted of sending images, sexual images, is going to be sentenced today. What can we expect there?
So, as you say, later today, this is the first of its kind in England we will see. There will be a case where an individual called Nicholas Hawkes, he's 39 years old, is being sentenced for sharing sexually indecent images of himself to a 15-year-old schoolgirl. Now, as I say, because this is the first time that this is being sentenced, it's only been criminalised in England since January the 31st, so it's a matter of months compared to Scotland. You know, this has been over there an issue since 2010. It's been deemed a criminal act. Now, how the judge will sentence Nicholas Hawkes, we will find out later. There probably will be a mixture of different laws that he will sort of combine, and that's because, as I say, we've not seen this happen before. It really is a unique case.
Saba, great stuff. Thanks so much. Now, AI companies are pioneering new technologies that can imitate a conversation with a loved one that's passed away. Is that going to be a comfort for many? Well, it is certainly for some. And Sky's technology correspondent, Arti Nachapan, has this report.
She's the person who taught me how to love myself. And at the time she died, we hadn't seen each other for like 6-7 years.
It was a reunion that never came. Serene's mother stayed behind in Syria when her daughter fled war in the country and moved to Germany. But before they could see each other again, she died unexpectedly. Struggling with unanswered questions, Serene turned to Project December, an AI tool that claims to simulate the dead.
I wanted that last, chance, even to speak to a computer that was pretending to be my mom. And, it was... when you're weak, you accept anything and you do things that are not really, really accurate, but you just want any outlet.
The tool she used requires you to fill out an online form about the person you've lost. For $10, your responses are fed into an AI chatbot which imitates them. For Serene, some of the results were quite realistic. In one of the conversations, Serene messaged, "Hi, Mama." "Are you well?" the chatbot responded. "I'm fine." So, are you eating well? Yes, I'm doing my best. I'm going to the shop for food today. Well, don't buy too much. Other conversations were more abstract. I'm watching you, the chatbot said. Serene responded, how do you watch me? Are you a rose? A butterfly? I'm the breeze. Are you a cool breeze in summer or a cold one in winter? I'm the breeze that blows when you want it to. The tool doesn't work for everyone, and that's something the founder is aware of.
Sometimes you'll be in the middle of a conversation with the AI and it'll just kind of make up a detail that it doesn't know. It'll talk about some cousin the person doesn't have and give the wrong name. So if you were able to actually train it on all the little details and things from a person's life, then I think it would be better. The problem, of course, is that it's expensive.
This isn't the only challenge. There are concerns that using the chatbot could disrupt the natural process of grieving.
I think the majority of grief therapy is about learning to come to terms with the absence, learning to recognise the new reality or the new normal. And so this could interrupt that. There is, the possibility that someone could become quite unwell.
Right now, anyone can use technology to imitate the dead with or without their consent. As these tools continue to develop, the challenge for regulators is how to protect both the living and the legacy of the deceased. Arti Nachiappan, Sky News.
Pleased to say Artie's here with us now. On my phone, I've got voice messages of my mum. She passed away 7 years ago, and it is such a comfort to have that, but I know that's my mum. How does this work then, and how does that really bring comfort to people who are grieving?
So this is basically based on an early version of the same technology behind ChatGPT, and it works by messaging. It basically takes in information fed to it by a bereaved person who has information about the person they've lost, for example, their age, things like the number of pets they might have, or a quote from them, so that the chatbot is trained on the information on how they talk. And essentially, it's not given that much information. It would probably be more, realistic if it were given more, but it's quite expensive, the founder said, to run it in that way. So essentially, it's people, I imagine a lot know that it's just an imitation, really, of the person they've lost, but it brings some sort of comfort if they're dealing with a sudden loss, and that's usually why a lot of people use this service.
On one level, it's kind of amazing and could bring great comfort to people. On another, it's terrifying. What are the laws around this sort of thing?
So, in short, there are very few. So the deceased don't really have any rights as far as the law is concerned. They can have people execute their will, people who represent them, but we don't know what they'd actually want in a lot of situations. And so I think that's part of the grey area here. And if you look at another part of it, it's that we don't really have any laws on AI. There are some in development, but at very early stages. So there are particular protections, for example, like copyright, which relates to the use of someone's image after they've passed. But specifically when it comes to a situation like this, there are very few protections. And I think that if this were to become more common as a practice, that would be something that needs to be assessed.
Artie, great stuff. Thanks so much. Lots more still to come here on The Breakfast Show. Up next, the measure of inflation moves with the music. Vinyl records spin back into the basket of goods we're buying the most. We'll discuss.
I'm Stuart Ramsey, and I'm Sky's chief correspondent. It's really desperate. That is actually the sort of pretty much hopeless column. We saw snatch squads going in, grabbing people.
You either live and recover, or you die. OK, so that's like a war.
That's the war. We help you understand the world with us. Over the past 24 hours, the soldiers have been attacked on a number of occasions.
It's really sending a clear message that Venezuela is eager for change.
Take you to the heart of stories that shape our world. They were convinced the United States would become hooked. They were right.
An enormous explosion has just come down. It's not out of control, but they've withdrawn. It's so hot. Welcome back to The Breakfast Show. Well, coming up, we're going to be talking about lions being transferred from Ukraine to South Africa. But first, we're going to talk about the rise of vinyl. And more than 30 years after they were taken off, records were among 16 items added back in to the inflation basket list, meaning that they're being bought enough that they now get part of government calculations once again. So here with us to discuss all of this, DJ and broadcaster Georgie Rogers. Georgie, very good morning to you.
Morning.
So clearly our peg for why we're talking about this is that they've gone back into the basket of goods that is used to calculate CPI inflation. And behind that is what people are really back into vinyl again.
Yeah, massively. We've seen a rise for the 16th consecutive year last year, and vinyl sales are now as good as they were in 1990. So that's quite a long way that they've come back, but just they've been steadily rising. I think, it's amazing to have the world of music at your fingertips with streaming services, but there's nothing quite like having the physical embodiment of the record, putting it on, listening to it as an album. The covers are often an artwork in themselves, and I think people really connect with that. I think if it's not streaming, you want to have the physical, and that seems to be vinyls rather than any other formats.
And I think we should explore that. Why? The why in this, because it's so important, isn't it? Like going into a library, picking up a book, smelling the book. It's the same, isn't it? When you go into a record shop, I remember spending many afternoons in Piccadilly Records in Manchester, and you meet people that you wouldn't necessarily meet. You see the artwork, and it's all of that, isn't it? Building a community. One of the reasons why we're seeing this increase.
Yeah, definitely. I think you want to have that emotional connection to the record. People are buying in terms of trends, Taylor Swift's album, Rolling Stones, Blur records. Those were the big sellers last year. But also people might go and buy a Fleetwood Mac Rumours album because it's a classic album and they want to have it on vinyl. They want to have that emotional connection. There's also the collectability of it and actually the sound quality as well. It doesn't really compare the richness and dynamic sound that you get from a record. It's less compressed than streaming versions of that music. So people want to back their artists. They want to have that as a collecting thing.
One thing I'm interested in your take on, Georgie, particularly as a DJ yourself, is the way it forces the listener to listen to the songs in the order that the artists initially intended them to do. Because I guess with streaming, even before that a little bit with sort of mini discs and making your own mixes, it's kind of like greatest hits you can listen to a playlist of, or just a hodgepodge of all different artists. And that whole kind of releasing an album and the sort of structure to it has sort of been lost. Does this mean it's going to come back, or realistically the vast majority of people will kind of cherry pick the individual songs they want to listen to still?
I think it's a bit different with streaming. We're much more scatterbrain about it, and that's kind of how, you're much more likely to skip a tune, aren't you? Whereas with the vinyl, you have to put it on the record, you have to turn it over halfway through. So you are more likely, a discerning music lover will listen to it as a full album. I still listen to albums from start to finish. I know a lot of people do. But I think, yeah, certainly with vinyl, that's part of the love of it, isn't it? Is actually getting into it from the journey perspective that the artist has made for you.
Who's buying vinyls, do you think? Because there will be a younger crowd possibly watching this morning. Is it the younger crowd or is it the older generation that are just feeling nostalgic?
I think there's the element of nostalgia, definitely the older generation, but I think new, younger people are getting into it. You know, their parents might have a record collection that they've gone through and, God, this is really cool.
It's actually quite cool, isn't it?
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of young people that are buying records and collecting records, and DJs and selectors who want to, you know, have rare records. And also, you know, actually, if you do sort of buy well, these things don't lose their value, and if anything, they go up. So there's that element to it as well.
Georgie, thanks so much for stopping by. Really interesting.
Thank
Georgie
you.
Rogers, DJ and broadcaster. Still to come here on The Breakfast Show, we'll tell you how 2 lions rescued from the war in Ukraine have found a new home in South Africa. Welcome back to The Breakfast Show. Leah, time for top stories.
Yep, thank you, Wilfred. So, what are we talking about this Tuesday morning? Well, Energy Minister Graham Stuart has warned against cancelling Conservative donors. He made the comment after saying that Frank Hester had been right to apologise over comments that saying Diane Abbott made him hate all black women. Labour is calling on the Conservative Party to return the money donated by Mr Hester. The online influencer Andrew Tate and his brother have been detained in Romania on a UK arrest warrant over allegations of sexual aggression. Charity ship Open Arms has left port in Larnaca, carrying almost 200 tonnes of food to Gaza. It's part of a pilot project opening a new sea aid route for Palestinians. The government says the UK needs to build more gas power capacity, not risking blackouts to meet climate targets. The Energy Minister also told this programme that he welcomed all donations to the Conservative Party after saying Frank Hester was right to apologise for offensive remarks.
Leah, thanks for that. Now, time to talk about artificial intelligence, and it may be the most transformative technology of our time, but as its power grows, experts warn of the need to figure out what it should and shouldn't be used for. Verity Harding, the author of AI Needs You, argues that it's critical for society to take the lead in answering this urgent set of questions, and she joins us now. Very good morning to you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
So, first and foremost, you think AI is overwhelmingly a good thing?
Well, I think, you know, it's an early stage of the technology that we're in, but we're seeing some really promising uses of it. The reason I've written the book really is because I have this kind of unique perspective. I've worked in both politics and technology, and being able to speak both those languages really teaches you that technology is very political. And the good news about that is it means, of course, that we can help shape and determine what this technology looks like in the future. And knowing that really empowers you to get involved. And I think if people are scared of the technology, they're going to disengage and not get involved. And I want more people involved in that conversation.
So the kind of starting point I always come to with this is, have we successfully regulated and addressed social media? Which I would argue we haven't done on all sides, Europe, UK, US. And with that, this is much more complicated and can potentially have a way bigger impact on our lives. And so I guess the question is, are you confident that we will successfully put up the guardrails around AI such that it will be used for the best rather than for the worst, given the sort of track record we've got from how politicians and both sides of the aisle have tried or not to address social media?
Yeah, of course. And I think looking at historical examples is a really good way to learn lessons for what the future can look like for AI. And in this book that I've written, which is out today, I've looked at 3 examples of really transformative technologies from the past. So I've looked at the space race, IVF, and the early internet. And what you can learn by looking at these historical examples is, well, actually, technology is something that we human beings build and we human beings get to shape. And in learning that, I think that gives you some comfort that actually, even if it takes a while and it's not perfect and it's delineated across different aspects, actually, we do have a really exciting ability as human beings to shape and guide the future of technology. We've done it before and we'll do it again. And somebody that read the book said to me, well, it makes me excited about technology, but it also makes me think that human beings are pretty great too. And, you know, we are, and we have these democratic systems, we have these processes, and these examples in the book show that we've been able to regulate technology successfully before, and I do think we will be able to.
And Verity, I wonder, you know, with anything new, there's always that fear factor, like you've mentioned. But with AI in particular, and Wilf touched on this too, it's about informing and educating, because there's so much misinformation online, you know, deep fake images of the Pope in a puffer jacket, for example. But from your point of view, how can AI be used to benefit humans?
Yes, and I think you're right to point out those concerning examples, and by saying that, I feel confident that human beings are going to be able to regulate and manage the future of this technology. That doesn't in any way diminish the fact that there really are some things we do need to regulate and manage, and I talk about those in the book, including deep fakes. But there are examples of AI having the potential to help us in other ways, and I think that it's very important that the people building the technology really have that in mind. What's the purpose? Why are you building this? What sort of society do we want to live in? And how do we ensure that AI enables that, rather than what sort of society will AI create and how do we just put up with it?
Where do you stand, Verity, and even if we harness it perfectly here, on what other countries might do with that, like China or like Russia? and how big a risk that is.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And actually, one of the examples in the book, the regulation of IVF, I show how the UK was actually the world leader in regulating human embryology research. We had this very incredibly inclusive process, and we have the gold standard. But of course, that's not true everywhere. And if you can't do what you want with human embryology research in one place, you might go somewhere else. So I think that is concerning, and AI is a global technology. So we do have to be careful. But my view is that just because it might be used for ill in other places doesn't mean that we, as the UK, shouldn't set an example. And I think if we set an example and show how AI can benefit our society, other countries will look to us and say, well, we want to do that too. So it's important, I think, to take a sort of moral leadership role.
Verity Harding, the author of the new book, AI Needs You, How We Can Change AI's Future and Save Our Own, which is out today. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, two lion brothers born into captivity in a Ukrainian zoo have found safety and lots of sun in their new forever home after years of exploitation. The duo, now part of a group of 50 big cats, are given sanctuary in Shamwari in South Africa. Well, joining us now, Will Travers from Born Free. So, Will, just talk us through what's happened here. So there was 2 lions from a zoo in Ukraine, that's right, and you've successfully moved them to South Africa.
Yes, well, thank you so much for having us on. It's a really great way for us to be celebrating Born Free's 40th anniversary. I can't believe that I co-founded it 40 years ago with my mum, Virginia McKenna, and my dad, Bill Travers. And what a great way to celebrate with these 2 young lions, Zar and Jamil. They, as you rightly say, they came from a zoo, but actually from an ostrich farm. And it was Ukrainian animal activists who first alerted everyone to the situation, managed to get the animals away from the ostrich farm and via various routes through Poland and then into Belgium to a halfway house. And then we've been able, with the help of incredible people, you know, British Airways Holidays, Cargo Lux, DHL, our team at Shamwari in South Africa, it's been an incredible team effort to get them to South Africa, where they will live the rest of their lives. It's not complete freedom. It can never be complete freedom. These animals have been in captivity too long, and it would be too difficult and too dangerous to return them fully to the wild, but they will have a life worth living.
Will, it's Leah here. Morning to you. Thanks for joining us on The Breakfast Show. Could you talk to us a bit more about what life will be like for the pair, and also settle a little dispute here? Do the lions need a passport at all to travel?
The lions do need all sorts of paperwork. In fact, it's one of the biggest challenges that anyone who moves animals from one country to another, wild animals from one country to another, especially when it's difficult to get the original paperwork when you have a country like Ukraine, which is facing so many challenges. You have to have the export paperwork, the health paperwork, the veterinary paperwork to get them out of the country. And then you have to have the reciprocal paperwork in South Africa. And hats off to both the Ukrainian and the South African authorities for expediting the paperwork to allow this move to go ahead, because without it, it can't. What will their life be like? Well, they will have an enclosure. It'll be about the size of a football field. It's natural South African bush, which at least ancestrally they would have evolved to live in. They'll be looked after 365 days a year. We have an incredible expert team down there led by Glenn and Catherine and Dr. Johan Joubert, who is a world-renowned veterinarian, along with the other big cats that we've rescued. And they will have a quality of life. They will also have choice. They'll be able to decide, when to go in and out of their night house, whether to sit in the sun, whether to sit in the shade, to climb onto their platform where they have a fantastic view over the surrounding countryside, which experts agree is very important for the mental welfare of animals in captivity. So it'll be, as I say, a life worth living.
Will Travers, thanks so much for joining us, and congrats on the 40-year anniversary of Born Free.
Thank you very much indeed for having me on.
Still to come here on The Breakfast Show, how British-made luxury cars are being sold to Russia despite sanctions. Ed Conway will be here next.
I'm Stuart Ramsey, and I'm Sky's chief correspondent. It's really desperate. That is actually the sort of pretty much hopeless column. We saw snatch squads going in, grabbing people.
You either live and recover, or you die.
OK, so that's like a war.
That's the war.
We help you understand the world with us. Over the past 24 hours, the soldiers have been attacked on a number of occasions. It's really sending a clear message that Venezuela is eager for change. Take you to the heart of stories that shape our world.
They were convinced the United States would become hooked. Well, they were right.
An enormous explosion has just come down. It's not out of control, but they've withdrawn. It's so hot.
If you forgot your pajamas, Emirates has got you covered. Fly Emirates, fly better.
Welcome back. A Sky News investigation has found hundreds of millions of pounds worth of British-made luxury vehicles are still being sold in Russia, despite sanctions imposed after the invasion of Ukraine. Rolls-Royce, Bentley and Land Rover are among the top brands still found in Moscow's sales rooms. Well, we'll get detailed response and analysis from economics and data editor Ed Conway in just a moment. He's standing by live for us, as you can see. But first, here's his report.
You don't have to go far in Moscow without seeing evidence of how much Russians love luxury goods. And that includes a lot of high-end Western brands and especially British automobiles.
Bentley.
After the invasion of Ukraine and the imposition of sanctions in 2022, that was all supposed to stop. Car makers pledged not to send their new models there. But a Sky News investigation has found these exports seem to be continuing even now.
Now, it's certainly true that UK car exports to Russia have fallen very sharply since the invasion, basically down to zero. But just look at what's happened over the same period with car exports to Azerbaijan. They have gone up at an unprecedented rate, into the hundreds of millions each year, up by 1,860%. We've never seen anything like that at all, raising the question, is something going on in Azerbaijan's economy? Well, not really. Developing economy, GDP about the same size as Ghana, 10 million people. But the main thing is, just look where it's sited, on the border of Russia. And when you look at what's happened to car exports from Azerbaijan to Russia since the invasion, they've done almost exactly the same thing as our exports to Azerbaijan. And that raises a final question. Where have our exports mainly come from? Well, the main port of departure is this one in the southwest of England.
Up until the invasion of Ukraine, the port of Bristol had never seen more than a few £1 million of exports to Azerbaijan. In the past couple of years, that's risen to the hundreds of millions.
This is one of the country's main ports for the import and export of cars, but among the models leaving here over the past 2 years have been thousands of high-end British cars going in vessels rather like that around Europe into the Black Sea and ending up almost certainly in Russia. Our data shows it's been happening. The question is why it hasn't been stopped.
After all, the sale of cars over £42,000 to Russia is explicitly banned under the UK's sanctions regime. Legal experts say industry needs to be more vigilant about what happens when their goods leave the UK.
When it comes to what is happening in practice is
most readily explained by a lack of due diligence. The industry has to be more aware of what red flags to look out for and what to do when they become aware of something that potentially looks like circumvention.
Britain's motoring lobby group, the SMMT, said UK vehicle manufacturers committed to full compliance with all current and future trade sanctions. There is no available evidence to indicate a lack of compliance with existing sanctions, but manufacturers will remain vigilant and will condemn any party that puts their commitment to compliance at risk. Sanctions Minister Anne-Marie Trevelyan said, "The work of investigative journalists and NGOs' continuing efforts to highlight circumvention are an important part of our collective efforts to track and evidence Putin's abhorrent crimes." The Azerbaijani car exports are just a fraction of those Britain sends around the world, but it's a fraction that looks increasingly awkward for a country which has said it wants to wage economic war on Russia.
As I said, Ed is standing by, able to join us on this. Ed, it's a fascinating report. I guess the question from here is how easy it would be and how damaging in the process it would be to the UK economy to quickly close this loophole, or would another one immediately pop up?
The short answer is it would be incredibly difficult. And what we're seeing at the moment, and it's not just cars, we had a report not that long ago about certain goods that are going into places like Kyrgyzstan. So all along that border, those former Soviet states in the Caucasus, Central Asia, do look like they have seen this enormous increase in imports of the kinds of things that were previously going to Russia. It's just very difficult once you've sent it, once it's left the port of Bristol, in this case, there you can see it. Once it's left port, it's quite difficult to actually control it, obviously, and especially when it gets into countries like Azerbaijan, like Kyrgyzstan. It is difficult to do much to either track it or control it. What we do know is those exports to those neighbouring states to Russia have risen at an extraordinary rate. There's very little else that could possibly explain this other than to say those goods are being sent into Russia. And you've seen from that report, we have data evidence suggesting an incredible increase in car exports from Azerbaijan to Russia, just as those have increased from the UK to Azerbaijan. I don't think it would be enormously damaging to the UK economy if this stuff was to stop, although it's worth saying these aren't big numbers. It's hundreds of millions of pounds, which obviously is benefiting the UK car industry. But that's quite a small fraction of the total exports from the UK, so I don't think it would be critical. The difficulty here is this stuff is difficult. It is really hard to try to control the flow of trade around the world because there are always some countries which will happily send it on to where you don't want it to go. I think it is tough, and what we're seeing at the moment is evidence of just how tough this is. And the beneficiary, of course, is Vladimir Putin.
Ed, it's really interesting because clearly this is a part of the sanctions that perhaps aren't working that allows rich Russians to buy expensive cars. Probably more important is stopping Russia exporting base products to give them the cash to continue their illegal invasion of Ukraine. And that's not really working that well either. I mean, countries like China and India buy the oil, it gets refined there and then still finds its ways into countries that should otherwise be sanctioning Russia.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, it's kind of a similar thing. So if what's happening right now is we're sending cars and they're going to somewhere like Azerbaijan, and then, in effect, they're being laundered, and then they go on to Russia. It's kind of laundry of your exports. Something similar happens with Russian oil. So Russia sends its oil out around the world. And by the way, the amount of Russian oil that's gone around the world hasn't really changed much. And at some point, we can do another kind of data wall showing you all of that. But then it leaves Russia, and rather than coming to a refinery, say, in the UK or in Europe, it goes instead to a refinery in China or in India and gets turned into diesel and jet fuel. And lo and behold, that diesel and jet fuel ends up back here in the UK. We are still consuming molecules that have come out of the ground in Russia. It's just that the global industry has been pretty ingenious at trying to find a way of getting this stuff from one place to another. As you say, going back to the first question, raising a question about how effective sanctions actually are. The government insists they're effective, but what we're seeing here is evidence of lots of stuff getting through.
Very, very quickly, Ed, 10 seconds. What was the data this morning on the UK economy?
Well, unemployment data actually up a little bit, but not that bad. It doesn't look like the economy is necessarily in a deep recession, and we're going to keep an eye on the GDP data that's coming out tomorrow. So it's tentatively all right news so far.
I hope you'll be breaking that alongside me tomorrow morning. I look forward to it. Ed Conway, thanks so much. Let's have a quick look at the weather.
Warm memories wherever you go. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
It'll be an unsettled week, but it will turn warmer as south-westerly winds set in. The far north and east look fine through the rush hour, but Wales and central and western England will be wet. That's your weather.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
As ever, it's been a great fun show this morning, guys. And the focus, Mari, today is a cabinet meeting, but also Lee Anderson, we know he's switched, but now appear in Parliament for the first time as a Reform MP.
Exactly, yes. About 11:30 this morning, he'll be appearing, and he will be the only Reform Party MP for the first time, interestingly. And Richard Tice is very excited about that. He spoke to you earlier, didn't he?
Yeah, he did indeed. And he's hoping to entice more people across, were his words, and we'll see if the government has to change its tune on those comments from its donor. Guys, great morning with you both. Thanks again. We'll do it all again tomorrow. Stay tuned. Sky News Today is up next.